The Pelasgians emerge from the mists of antiquity as one of the most enigmatic peoples of the ancient Mediterranean world. Their story begins not with clear historical records, but with fragments scattered across ancient literature, archaeological remnants, and the ghostly echoes of languages long extinct. Understanding the Pelasgians requires piecing together evidence from multiple disciplines, each offering glimpses into a civilization that predated the classical Greek world we know today. Homer's epic poems provide our earliest substantial literary references to the Pelasgians, though these references present a complex and sometimes contradictory picture. In the Iliad, the Pelasgians appear as allies of Troy, fighting alongside Hector against the Aegean forces. Homer describes them as dwelling in fertile Larissa, led by the warrior Hippothous and Peleus, sons of Lethus. The poet's description places them firmly within the Trojan alliance, suggesting they controlled significant territory in the Troad region. Their warriors are portrayed as formidable fighters, equipped with bronze weapons and participating in the great battles before Troy's walls. The geographic specificity of Homer's account proves particularly intriguing. Larissa, described as their stronghold, appears to have been a well-fortified settlement with rich agricultural land surrounding it. Archaeological investigations in the region have revealed Bronze Age settlements that align chronologically with the traditional dating of the Trojan War, though direct connections remain elusive. The material culture uncovered includes pottery styles that differ markedly from contemporary Mycenaean and Greek ceramics, suggesting distinct cultural traditions. In the Odyssey, Homer presents a different perspective on the Pelasgians. Here they appear as inhabitants of Crete, living alongside other peoples, including the Achaeans, Sidonians, Dorians, and Eteocretes. This reference suggests the Pelasgians were not confined to a single geographic region, but rather represented a widespread population group across the eastern Mediterranean. The Cretan Pelasgians are described as occupying specific territories on the island, implying established settlements and organised communities rather than nomadic bands. The archaeological record from Lemnos provides some of the most compelling evidence for pre-Greek populations in the Aegean. Excavations on this volcanic island have revealed settlements dating back to the early Bronze Age, with material culture that shows both local development and connections to Anatolia. The pottery assemblages from sites like Polyochni demonstrate sophisticated ceramic traditions that predate Greek colonization of the island. These vessels display distinctive decorative motifs and manufacturing techniques that differ from a mainland Greek pottery of comparable periods. Particularly significant are the architectural remains found on Lemnos. The settlement at Polyochni, often cited as one of Europe's oldest cities, shows evidence of urban planning and fortification systems that suggest a complex society. The walls, constructed with carefully fitted stone blocks, enclosed an area containing residential quarters, storage facilities, and what appear to be administrative buildings. The construction techniques employed show knowledge of advanced masonry and engineering principles, indicating a sophisticated building tradition. Imbros, Lemnos' neighbouring island, has yielded similar archaeological evidence. Excavations have uncovered Bronze Age settlements with pottery and architectural features that parallel those found on Lemnos. The consistency of material culture across these islands suggests a shared cultural sphere that extended beyond individual communities. Burial practices revealed through excavation show distinctive customs, including jar burials for infants and elaborate grave goods that indicate social stratification. Mainland Greece presents a more complex archaeological picture regarding pre-Greek populations. Sites across Thessaly, Boeotia, and the Peloponnese have yielded evidence of Bronze Age settlements that predate the arrival of Greek-speaking peoples. The material culture from these sites often shows characteristics distinct from later Mycenaean civilization, suggesting different cultural traditions and possibly different ethnic groups. The linguistic evidence for Pelasgian presence comes primarily through analysis of place names that appear to preserve pre-Greek elements. Many Greek place names contain suffixes like enthos, ssos, and ttitos that linguists consider markers of pre-Indo-European languages. Names such as Corinthos, Parnassos, and Hymettos demonstrate these patterns. The distribution of such names across the Greek world suggests widespread pre-Greek settlement, though connecting these linguistic remnants specifically to the Pelasgians remains problematic. More intriguing are place names that ancient sources explicitly attributed to Pelasgian origins. The Thessalian toponyms like Larissa, which Homer connected to the Pelasgians, appear multiple times across the Greek world. Several cities named Larissa existed in antiquity, from Thessaly to Asia Minor, potentially indicating Pelasgian settlement patterns or cultural influence. The name itself may derive from a pre-Greek root meaning citadel or fortified place, suggesting the Pelasgians were accomplished in defensive architecture. River names provide another category of potentially Pelasgian linguistic heritage. Many Greek rivers bear names that resist Indo-European etymology, such as the Kephisos, Ilissos, and Peneos. These hydronyms often preserve the most archaic linguistic elements in any given region, as river names tend to persist through population changes and linguistic shifts. The concentration of such names in areas where ancient sources placed Pelasgian settlements strengthens the case for their pre-Greek origin. Ancient etymologies of the name Pelasgian itself reveal how classical writers understood these peoples. Strabo, writing in the 1st century BC, discussed various theories about the name's meaning. Some ancient scholars connected it to the Greek word pelagos, meaning sea, interpreting the Pelasgians as sea peoples or coastal dwellers. This etymology aligned with their apparent distribution across islands and coastal regions of the Mediterranean. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, a contemporary of Strabo, offered a different interpretation. He suggested the name derived from Pelasgos, a legendary ancestor figure, connecting the Pelasgians to the heroic age of Greek mythology. According to this tradition, Pelasgus was an autochthonous king, meaning he was born from the earth itself rather than descended from other peoples. This mythological framework positioned the Palastians as the original inhabitants of Greek lands, present before the arrival of the Hellenes. Other ancient sources propose that Pelasgian meant ancient or old, emphasizing their status as an indigenous population. This interpretation appears in various classical texts and suggests that even in antiquity, the Palastians were viewed as representing an earlier phase of Mediterranean civilization. The consistency of this characterization across different ancient authors indicates a widespread understanding of the Pelasgians as a pre-existing population. Archaeological evidence from sacred sites adds another dimension to our understanding of Pelasgian culture. Several sanctuaries in Greece were traditionally attributed to Pelasgian foundation, including the oracle at Dodona in Epirus. Excavations at Dodona have revealed Bronze Age deposits beneath the classical temple, suggesting continuous religious activity at the site for over a millennium. The cult practices at Dodona, involving the interpretation of sounds from a sacred oak tree, differed markedly from typical Greek religious customs and may preserve pre-Greek religious traditions. The sanctuary of the great gods on Samothrace presents similar evidence. This mystery cult centre attracted initiates from across the Mediterranean world, including prominent figures like Herodotus and Philip II of Macedon. Ancient sources attributed the establishment of these mysteries to the Pelasgians, and archaeological investigation has confirmed pre-Greek activity at the site. The religious practices involved elaborate initiation ceremonies and the worship of chthonic deities, suggesting religious traditions that preceded Greek colonization of the island. Material culture analysis reveals technological traditions that may reflect Pelasgian heritage. Certain pottery styles found across the pre-Greek Aegean show consistent characteristics in form, decoration, and manufacturing technique. These ceramics often feature distinctive burnished surfaces and geometric patterns that differ from later Greek styles. The distribution of these pottery types corresponds roughly with areas where ancient sources placed Pelasgian populations, though establishing direct ethnic connections remains challenging. Metallurgical evidence provides additional insights into pre-Greek technological traditions. Bronze Age sites attributed to pre-Greek populations show sophisticated metalworking capabilities, including the production of complex bronze alloys and advanced casting techniques. The consistency of these technologies across different sites suggests shared knowledge and possibly shared cultural identity among pre-Greek populations. The question of Pelasgian origins remains one of the most debated aspects of their history. Some scholars argue for an Anatolian origin, pointing to cultural and linguistic connections between pre-Greek Aegean populations and contemporary Anatolian civilizations. The similarities in pottery styles, architectural techniques, and religious practices between sites like Polyochni on Lemnos and contemporary Anatolian settlements support this theory. Alternative theories propose indigenous development, suggesting the Pelasgians represented local populations that developed their distinctive culture through long residence in the Aegean region. This interpretation emphasizes the deep roots of Pelasgian civilization and their role as the foundational population of the Greek world. The evidence for continuous occupation at many sites from the Neolithic period through the Bronze Age supports this view of indigenous development. The transition from mythological and archaeological evidence to documented historical accounts marks a crucial shift in our understanding of the Pelasgians. Classical historians, writing centuries after the events they described, provide our most detailed textual evidence about these enigmatic peoples. Their accounts, while invaluable, must be examined critically, as they often reflect the perspectives and biases of their own times rather than objective historical records. Herodotus of Halicarnassus, writing in the 5th century BC, presents the most comprehensive ancient account of the Pelasgians. His investigations into their origins, distribution and interactions with early Greek populations form the foundation of most subsequent scholarly discussion. According to Herodotus, the Pelasgians constituted the original inhabitants of what would later become Greece, occupying the land before the arrival of Hellenic peoples. He describes them as autochthonous, meaning they emerge from the earth itself rather than migrating from elsewhere, a characterization that emphasizes their status as the primordial population of the region. Herodotus provides specific geographic details about Pelasgian settlements, placing them initially in regions that would later become associated with major Greek city-states. He identifies Attica as having been originally Pelasgian territory, with the indigenous population living there before Ionian Greeks established their dominance. The historian describes how these early inhabitants occupied the mountainous regions around what would become Athens, particularly the area near the Acropolis, where they maintained fortified positions that controlled access to the surrounding plains. The account of Pelasgian Greek interactions in Herodotus reveals a complex pattern of conflict, displacement, and cultural exchange. He describes how the incoming Hellenic populations gradually displaced the Pelasgians from their traditional territories, forcing them to seek new homes across the Mediterranean. This process was not uniform or immediate, but occurred over several generations through a combination of military conquest, political pressure, and voluntary migration. The Pelasgians, according to Herodotus, possessed sufficient military capability to resist Greek expansion for considerable periods, suggesting they maintained organized communities with effective leadership structures. One of the most detailed episodes in Herodotus concerns the Pelasgian settlement on Lemnos and their subsequent interactions with Athenian colonists. He describes how Pelasgians from Attica, after being expelled from their homeland, established themselves on the volcanic island where they built fortified settlements and developed agricultural communities. These island Pelasgians maintained their distinct cultural identity while adapting to their new environment, creating a hybrid society that combined traditional practices with innovations necessitated by their island location. The Lemnian Palastians, as described by Herodotus, engaged in maritime activities that brought them into contact with various Mediterranean peoples. They developed sophisticated sailing vessels capable of long-distance voyages and established trading relationships with communities across the Aegean. Their strategic position on Lemnos allowed them to control important sea routes, generating wealth through taxation of passing merchant vessels and direct participation in interregional commerce. Herodotus provides fascinating details about Pelasgian religious practices, which he presents as distinctly different from contemporary Greek customs. He describes their worship of unnamed deities, referring to them simply as the gods without specific names or attributes. This practice contrasted sharply with Greek religious traditions, which involved elaborate mythologies and clearly defined divine personalities. The Palastian approach to religion, according to Herodotus, emphasized ritual actions and offerings rather than complex theological systems, suggesting a more archaic form of religious expression. The historian also records Pelasgian linguistic characteristics, noting that they spoke a language unintelligible to contemporary Greeks. He describes encountering Pelasgian-speaking communities during his travels and observes that their language contained elements that seemed ancient even by the standards of his own time. Herodotus suggests that this linguistic distinctiveness contributed to their cultural isolation and may have facilitated their displacement by Greek-speaking populations who could more easily coordinate military and political activities. Thucydides, writing later in the 5th century BC, provides additional perspective on Pelasgian populations, particularly focusing on their presence in Attica and their eventual expulsion from the region. His account, more analytical and less anecdotal than that of Herodotus, examines the political and military factors that led to Pelasgian displacement. Thucydides describes the Pelasgians as occupying specific districts within Attica, including areas that would later become central to Athenian identity and power. According to Thucydides, the Palastians maintained autonomous communities within Attica for generations after the initial Greek settlement of the region. These communities possessed their own leadership structures and continued to practice traditional customs while adapting to the presence of Greek neighbours. The coexistence was not always peaceful, with periodic conflicts arising over territorial boundaries, resource access, and cultural differences. Thucydides provides detailed analysis of the factors that ultimately led to Pelasgian expulsion from Attica. He identifies population pressure as a primary cause, noting that Greek immigration to the region increased steadily over time, creating competition for agricultural land and other resources. The Palastians, despite their indigenous status, found themselves increasingly marginalized as Greek communities grew in size and political influence. The military aspects of Pelasgian displacement receive particular attention in Thucydides' account. He describes how Athenian forces systematically reduced Pelasgian strongholds, employing siege tactics and coordinated assaults to overcome defensive positions that have protected these communities for generations. The Pelasgians, according to Thucydides, fought with determination and skill, but ultimately lacked the numerical strength and technological advantages necessary to resist sustained Greek military pressure. Thucydides also examines the legal and political mechanisms through which Pelasgian expulsion was accomplished. He describes how Athenian authorities used accusations of impiety and foreign influence to justify the removal of Pelasgian communities from sacred sites and traditional territories. These legal proceedings, while presented as protecting religious sanctity, serve primarily to legitimize the transfer of valuable land from Pelasgian to Greek control. Pausanias, writing much later in the 2nd century AD, provides extensive documentation of Pelasgian sites and traditions that had survived into the Roman period. His systematic description of Greek sacred places includes numerous references to Pelasgian foundations and the persistence of pre-Greek religious practices. Pausanias encountered physical remains of Pelasgian settlements during his travels and recorded local traditions that preserved memories of their former inhabitants. The geographic scope of Pelasgian settlement, as documented by Pausanias, extends far beyond the regions described by earlier historians. He identifies Pelasgian foundations in the Peloponnese, central Greece, and various Aegean islands, suggesting a much more extensive distribution than previously recognised. Many of these sites retained architectural features that locals attributed to Pelasgian construction, including massive stone walls built without mortar and defensive works positioned to control strategic mountain passes. Pausanias provides detailed descriptions of Pelasgian architectural techniques, noting their preference for megalithic construction and their skill in working with irregular stone blocks. He describes walls at various sites where enormous stones were fitted together with remarkable precision, creating defensive structures that had survived for centuries without significant maintenance. These architectural achievements, according to Pausanias, demonstrated sophisticated engineering knowledge and organisational capability that contradicted contemporary assumptions about pre-Greek technological limitations. Religious sites attributed to Pelasgian foundation receive extensive coverage in Pausanias' work. He documents sanctuaries where local traditions maintained that Pelasgians had first established divine worship, often at locations featuring natural phenomena such as springs, caves, or unusual rock formations. These sites frequently continued to attract religious observance throughout the classical period, suggesting the persistence of pre-Greek sacred traditions within evolving religious practices. Apollodorus, the mythographer whose work survives in later compilations, provides genealogical and mythological frameworks that attempt to integrate Pelasgian traditions with broader Greek legendary history. His accounts, while obviously mythological in content, preserve cultural memories that may reflect actual historical relationships between Pelasgian and Greek populations. Apollodorus describes intermarriage between Pelasgian and Greek royal families, suggesting periods of peaceful coexistence and cultural exchange. The mythological narratives preserved by Apollodorus include detailed descriptions of Pelasgian kings and their achievements in establishing cities, introducing agricultural techniques, and founding religious cults. While these stories cannot be accepted as literal historical accounts, they provide insights into how later Greek writers understood Pelasgian contributions to early Mediterranean civilization. The consistent portrayal of Pelasgians as culture bearers and city founders suggests recognition of their role in establishing foundational elements of Greek society. Strabo, writing in the early Roman period, synthesizes earlier sources while adding his own geographic observations about regions formerly inhabited by Pelasgians. His systematic approach to geographic description includes analysis of place names, settlement patterns, and cultural survivals that he attributes to Pelasgian influence. Strabo's work is particularly valuable for understanding how Roman period scholars interpreted the relationship between pre-Greek populations and the classical civilization that succeeded them. The reliability of these classical sources requires careful evaluation, as each author wrote with specific purposes and audiences in mind. Herodotus, despite his reputation as the father of history, often included unverified stories and local legends alongside more reliable information. His account of the Pelasgians reflects both genuine historical investigation and the incorporation of folk traditions that may have distorted actual events. The geographic and chronological distance between Herodotus and the events he describes necessitates caution in accepting his account as completely accurate. Thucydides, while generally more critical in his approach to sources, was primarily interested in contemporary political and military events. His references to the Pelasgians serve mainly to provide historical context for Athenian territorial claims, rather than to document Pelasgian history for its own sake. This focus may have led him to emphasize aspects of Pelasgian-Greek interaction that supported Athenian political narratives while overlooking other important elements of their relationship. Later sources like Pausanias and Strabo had access to local traditions and physical remains that earlier historians could not examine. but they also wrote at considerable temporal distance from the events they described. Their accounts may preserve authentic memories of Pelasgian presence, but these memories had been filtered through centuries of retelling and reinterpretation. The Roman cultural context in which these authors wrote may have influenced their understanding of pre-Greek populations and their relationship to classical civilization. Archaeological evidence provides opportunities to test the accuracy of classical sources, though direct correlation between textual accounts and material remains proves challenging. Excavations at sites identified by ancient authors as Pelasgian have sometimes confirmed the presence of pre-Greek settlements, but establishing ethnic identity from material culture alone remains problematic. The absence of Pelasgian written records means that archaeological interpretation must rely heavily on the same classical sources whose accuracy is being evaluated. The volcanic island of Lemnos stands as perhaps the most significant archaeological window into Pelasgian civilization, offering tangible evidence that transforms abstract historical accounts into concrete cultural reality. Located strategically in the northern Aegean, approximately 40 kilometers southwest of the Gallipoli Peninsula, Lemnos commanded crucial maritime routes between the Hellespont and the broader Mediterranean. The island's unique position made it a natural staging point for populations moving between Anatolia and the Greek mainland, while its volcanic soil provided exceptional agricultural opportunities that sustained substantial communities throughout antiquity. Archaeological investigations on Lemnos have revealed settlement patterns spanning from the Neolithic period through the Roman era, with particularly significant discoveries dating to the Bronze Age and early Iron Age periods, when Palastian occupation reached its zenith. The site of Polyochny, located on the island's eastern coast, represents one of Europe's earliest urban centres, with sophisticated defensive walls, planned residential districts, and evidence of complex social organisation dating to the 3rd millennium BC. Excavations have uncovered multiple building phases, each demonstrating technological advancement and population growth that suggest continuous occupation by a stable, prosperous community. The fortification systems at Polyochny reveal remarkable engineering sophistication, with massive stone walls constructed using carefully selected basalt blocks fitted together without mortar. These defensive structures, rising to heights of over 4 meters in some sections, enclosed an area of approximately 10 hectares and featured strategically positioned gates that controlled access to the settlement's interior. The wall construction demonstrates knowledge of advanced masonry techniques, including the use of header and stretcher courses that distributed weight effectively and created structures capable of withstanding both military assault and seismic activity, common to the volcanic region. Within the protected area of Polyochny, excavators have identified distinct residential quarters arranged according to apparent social hierarchies. Larger houses, constructed with superior materials and featuring multiple rooms around central courtyards, cluster in the settlement's elevated central area, while smaller, simpler structures occupy the periphery near the defensive walls. These architectural distinctions suggest a stratified society with clear differences in wealth and status, contradicting earlier assumptions about pre-Greek populations as primitive or egalitarian communities. The discovery of the famous Lemnian Stele in 1885 near Kaminia on the island's northern coast marked a revolutionary moment in understanding pre-Greek languages and their relationship to other Mediterranean linguistic traditions. This remarkable artifact, carved from local volcanic stone and standing approximately 1 meter in height, bears inscriptions in a script that shares significant similarities with Etruscan writing while displaying unique characteristics that distinguish it as a separate linguistic tradition. The stele's text, arranged in vertical columns reading from right to left, contains approximately 40 words distributed across multiple lines of varying length. Epigraphic analysis of the Lemnian inscriptions reveals a language that employs an alphabetic script derived ultimately from Phoenician models, but adapted to express sounds and grammatical structures distinct from known Indo-European languages. The character forms show clear relationships to Etruscan letter shapes, particularly in the representation of certain consonants and vowels, yet display sufficient variation to indicate independent development rather than direct borrowing. Several letters appear unique to the Lemnian script, suggesting phonetic distinctions that existed in the spoken language but were not represented in other contemporary writing systems. The linguistic content of the Lemnian Stele has generated extensive scholarly debate regarding its relationship to Etruscan and other ancient Mediterranean languages. Detailed comparative analysis has identified numerous lexical items that appear cognate with Etruscan vocabulary, including personal names, religious terminology, and grammatical particles. The name Acca appears on the stele in what seems to be a dedicatory context, paralleling similar onomastic elements found in Etruscan inscriptions from central Italy. Additionally, the word Sivai, which appears to function as a divine epithet, shows striking similarity to Etruscan religious vocabulary. Morphological analysis of the Lemnian text reveals grammatical structures that align more closely with Etruscan patterns than with contemporary Indo-European languages of the region. Case endings, verbal inflections, and syntactic arrangements all demonstrate characteristics typical of the Etruscan linguistic family, rather than the Greek or Anatolian language groups. This evidence strongly supports theories proposing genetic relationships between the Lemnian language and the broader Ticenian language family, which includes Etruscan and possibly Rhaetic languages of the Alpine region. The implications of these linguistic connections extend far beyond mere academic classification, offering insights into population movements and cultural relationships across the ancient Mediterranean. If Lemnian and Etruscan languages derive from common ancestral sources, their speakers likely shared cultural traditions and possibly common origins that predate the historical periods documented in classical sources. The geographic distribution of related languages suggests either large-scale migration patterns or the existence of a linguistic continuum that once extended across much of the central and eastern Mediterranean. Additional inscriptions discovered on Lemnos, though fragmentary and often difficult to interpret, provide supplementary evidence for the island's unique linguistic heritage. Shorter texts found on pottery vessels, bronze objects, and architectural elements display consistent use of the same script and appear to contain personal names, ownership marks, and possibly religious invocations. The distribution of these inscribed objects throughout various archaeological contexts suggests widespread literacy among the Lemnian population, or at least among certain social classes, indicating a sophisticated cultural tradition that valued written communication. Religious practices on Lemnos, as revealed through archaeological investigation, display distinctive characteristics that set them apart from contemporary Greek traditions, while showing possible connections to an Anatolian and central Mediterranean cult practices. Excavations have uncovered numerous votive deposits containing terracotta figurines, bronze objects, and ceramic vessels that appear to have been offered to divine powers at sacred sites throughout the island. The sanctuary sites on Lemnos demonstrate architectural features that differ markedly from typical Greek temple design. Rather than the rectangular columned structures characteristic of classical Greek religious architecture, Lemnian sacred spaces often feature circular or oval foundations, with central hearths and surrounding areas for ritual activity. These layouts suggest religious practices that emphasize communal participation and fire-based ceremonies rather than the more formal, priest-mediated rituals typical of Greek religious tradition. Burial customs documented on Lemnos provide additional evidence for distinctive cultural practices that persisted throughout the island's pre-Greek occupation. Cemetery excavations have revealed consistent patterns of inhumation burial, with grave goods that reflect both local traditions and broader Mediterranean connections. Adult burials typically feature the deceased placed in extended positions, with heads oriented towards specific cardinal directions, possibly reflecting cosmological beliefs about the afterlife journey. Grave goods include locally produced pottery, bronze jewellery, and imported objects that demonstrate participation in extensive trade networks. Particularly significant are the burial practices associated with infants and children, which show distinctive characteristics not found in contemporary Greek cemeteries. Young individuals were often interred in large storage jars or pithoi, which were then buried beneath house floors or in designated cemetery areas. This practice, known as pithos burial, appears throughout the Eastern Mediterranean during the Bronze Age, but shows specific local variations on Lemnos that suggest indigenous cultural development rather than simple adoption of foreign customs. The material culture preserved in Lemnian archaeological contexts reveals sophisticated craft traditions that combined local innovations with influences from across the Mediterranean world. Pottery production reached particularly high levels of technical and artistic achievement, with vessels displaying distinctive decorative motifs and manufacturing techniques that distinguish them from contemporary Greek ceramics. Lemnian potters developed unique glazing techniques that produced lustrous surface finishes and employed decorative schemes featuring geometric patterns, stylized animal figures, and abstract designs that may have carried symbolic meaning. Metalworking evidence from Lemnos demonstrates advanced technological capabilities that enabled the production of complex bronze alloys and sophisticated cast objects. Archaeological deposits contain bronze weapons, tools, and ornamental objects that display superior craftsmanship and innovative design features. Particularly notable are bronze vessels with elaborate handles shaped as animal figures and decorative elements that suggest both functional and ceremonial uses. The technical quality of these objects indicates specialized craftsmen with extensive knowledge of metallurgical processes and access to high-quality raw materials. The economic foundations of Lemnian society, as revealed through archaeological analysis, rested on a combination of agricultural production, craft specialization, and maritime commerce that generated sufficient wealth to support substantial urban populations and monumental construction projects. Agricultural implements found throughout the island demonstrate sophisticated farming techniques adapted to the volcanic soil conditions, including specialized plows, harvesting tools, and storage facilities designed to preserve grain and other agricultural products through seasonal variations. Maritime activities played a crucial role in Lemnian economic life, as evidenced by harbour installations, shipbuilding facilities, and imported goods that demonstrate extensive trading relationships. The natural harbours on Lemnos provided excellent protection for vessels engaged in interregional commerce, while the island's strategic position made it a natural stopping point for ships travelling between the Black Sea region and southern Mediterranean destinations. Archaeological evidence suggests Lemnian merchants maintained regular contact with communities in Anatolia, the Greek mainland, and possibly more distant regions. The historical accounts of conflicts between Lemnian, Pelasgians, and Athenian forces, as recorded by Herodotus and other classical sources, find archaeological support in evidence for violent destruction and subsequent cultural changes on the island. Excavations at several sites have revealed destruction layers dating to the 6th century BC, when historical sources place the Athenian conquest of Lemnos under Miltiades. These archaeological deposits contain burned building remains, scattered artifacts, and evidence for hasty abandonment that align with accounts of military conquest and population displacement. The process of Hellenicization following Athenian conquest appears gradual rather than immediate, with archaeological evidence suggesting continued use of traditional Lemnian cultural practices alongside newly introduced Greek customs. Pottery assemblages from post-conquest contexts show mixtures of local and imported Greek styles, while burial practices demonstrate similar cultural blending. This evidence suggests that Hellenization involved cultural accommodation and synthesis rather than complete replacement of indigenous traditions. Religious syncretism provides particularly clear evidence for the gradual nature of cultural change on Lemnos. Sacred sites that had served Pelasgian religious practices continued to attract devotional activity under Greek rule, though the specific deities worshipped and ritual practices employed evolved to incorporate Greek elements. Votive offerings from later periods show combinations of traditional Lemnian forms with Greek iconographic elements, suggesting religious practices that satisfied both indigenous populations and Greek colonists. The linguistic transformation of Lemnos following Hellenization left traces in local dialects and place names that persisted into later periods. While the Lemnian language apparently ceased to function as a living spoken tongue within a few generations of the Athenian conquest, substrate influences continued to affect the Greek dialects spoken on the island. Phonetic characteristics, vocabulary items, and syntactic patterns in later Lemnian Greek show influences that likely derive from the pre-Greek linguistic tradition, providing additional evidence for cultural continuity despite political conquest. The mountainous landscapes of central Greece and the expansive plains of Thessaly preserve some of the most compelling archaeological evidence for Pelasgian settlement patterns and their complex interactions with emerging Greek populations. These regions, characterized by fertile river valleys interspersed with rugged highland terrain, provided ideal conditions for the mixed agricultural and pastoral economies that sustained pre-Greek communities for millennia before the arrival of Indo-European speaking peoples. Thessaly's archaeological record reveals continuous occupation from the Neolithic period through the Bronze Age, with settlement patterns that demonstrate sophisticated adaptation to the region's diverse topography. The Peneus River Valley, stretching from the Pindus Mountains to the Aegean coast, contained numerous Bronze Age sites that display material culture distinct from contemporary Mycenaean civilization further south. Excavations at Dimini, near modern Volos, have uncovered elaborate settlement complexes featuring concentric defensive walls, constructed with massive stone blocks, residential areas organised according to apparent social hierarchies, and evidence for specialised craft production that indicates complex economic organisation. The fortification systems at Dimini demonstrate construction techniques that parallel those found at Pelasgian sites elsewhere in the Aegean, particularly in their use of polygonal masonry and their integration with natural topographic features. The outer defensive wall, constructed with carefully fitted limestone blocks weighing several tons each, enclosed an area of approximately 15 hectares and featured strategically positioned gates that controlled access to the settlement's interior. These defensive works required coordinated labour from substantial populations and demonstrate engineering knowledge that contradicts earlier assumptions about pre-Greek technological capabilities. Pottery assemblages from Thessalian Bronze Age sites display distinctive characteristics that set them apart from contemporary Mycenaean ceramics, while showing connections to material culture traditions found across the northern Aegean. The vessels feature burnished surfaces decorated with incised geometric patterns, relief ornaments, and painted designs that employ colour schemes and motifs distinct from southern Greek pottery traditions. Particularly notable are large storage jars, or pithoi, decorated with applied plastic ornaments in the form of stylized human figures, animal representations, and abstract symbols that may have carried religious or social significance. The distribution of these distinctive pottery styles across Thessaly suggests cultural unity among pre-Greek populations throughout the region, while variations in specific decorative elements indicate local developments within broader shared traditions. Sites in the eastern plains near the coast show stronger connections to Aegean island material culture, while settlements in the western mountains display influences from contemporary Balkan traditions. This pattern suggests that Thessalian Palastians maintained extensive contact networks that facilitated cultural exchange across substantial geographic distances. Religious practices in pre-Greek Thessaly as revealed through archaeological investigation centered on sacred sites that exploited natural features such as springs, caves, and prominent rock formations. The sanctuary at Ptheotis, located near the sources of the Spercheios River, contains Bronze Age deposits that predate classical Greek religious activity by several centuries. Excavations have uncovered numerous votive offerings, including bronze figurines, ceramic vessels, and stone objects that appear to have been deposited in ritual contexts associated with water worship and fertility cults. The figurines found at Thessalian religious sites display iconographic characteristics that differ markedly from later Greek religious art, while showing connections to contemporary Anatolian and Balkan traditions. Female figures predominate among the votive offerings, typically featuring exaggerated sexual characteristics and poses that emphasize fertility and reproductive capacity. Male figures, less common but equally distinctive, often carry weapons or tools and display attributes that suggest associations with warfare, hunting, or agricultural activities. Cave sanctuaries throughout the Thessalian mountains preserve evidence for religious practices that continued from the Bronze Age into the Classical period, suggesting remarkable continuity in sacred traditions despite population changes and cultural transformations. The cave of Theopetra, located in the Meteora region, contains stratified deposits spanning several millennia, with Bronze Age levels revealing ritual deposits that include pottery vessels, bronze objects, and animal bones that appear to represent sacrificial offerings. The persistence of religious activity at such sites suggests that incoming Greek populations adopted and adapted pre-existing sacred traditions rather than completely replacing them. The relationship between Pelasgians and the oracle at Dodona represents one of the most significant aspects of their religious heritage and its influence on later Greek culture. Located in the mountains of Epirus, near the modern Albanian border, Dodona functioned as a major oracular centre throughout antiquity, with traditions attributing its foundation to Pelasgian priests, who interpreted divine messages through the sounds produced by sacred oak trees. Archaeological investigation at the site has confirmed Bronze Age religious activity that predates the classical sanctuary by several centuries, supporting ancient claims about pre-Greek origins for the oracle. Excavations at Dodona have revealed Bronze Age deposits containing pottery, bronze objects, and other artifacts that demonstrate continuous religious activity from at least the 2nd millennium BC. The early phases of the sanctuary appear to have focused on a sacred grove of oak trees, with ritual activity concentrated around specific trees that were believed to communicate divine messages through the rustling of their leaves, the sounds made by bronze vessels suspended from their branches, and the behaviour of sacred doves that nested in their foliage. The priests who served at Dodona during its early phases, according to both archaeological evidence and historical accounts, maintained religious traditions that differed significantly from later Greek practices. Rather than the elaborate temple complexes and anthropomorphic divine representations characteristic of classical Greek religion, the early Dodona sanctuary emphasized direct communication with divine forces through natural phenomena. This approach to religious practice aligns with evidence from other Pelasgian sites and suggests distinctive theological concepts that influenced the development of Greek religious thought. The connection between Dodona and Zeus, the chief deity of the classical Greek pantheon, appears to represent a synthesis of pre-Greek religious traditions with Indo-European divine concepts introduced by incoming Greek populations. Archaeological evidence suggests that the site's original divine focus centered on earth and fertility deities associated with agricultural abundance and natural cycles, while the Zeus cult incorporated these earlier traditions within new theological frameworks that emphasize sky gods and patriarchal divine hierarchies. Herodotus provides detailed accounts of Dodona's Pelasgian origins, describing how the oracle's establishment resulted from divine intervention that brought sacred doves from Egyptian Thebes to the oak grove in Epirus. While the specific details of this account clearly contain mythological elements, the underlying tradition of Egyptian connections may reflect actual cultural contacts between Mediterranean religious centres during the Bronze Age. Archaeological evidence from Dodona includes imported objects that demonstrate connections to various Mediterranean regions, supporting the possibility of long-distance religious exchanges. The linguistic evidence preserved in traditions about Dodona's oracular pronouncements provides additional insights into Pelasgian cultural heritage. Ancient sources describe how the early priests spoke in archaic languages that required interpretation for contemporary Greek audiences, suggesting the persistence of pre-Greek linguistic traditions in religious contexts long after their disappearance from everyday use. Certain formulaic expressions and technical terms associated with oracular practice appear to preserve non-Indo-European linguistic elements that may derive from Pelasgian origins. The fortification techniques attributed to Pelasgian construction throughout central Greece and Thessaly demonstrate sophisticated engineering knowledge and organisational capabilities that enabled these populations to create defensive works of remarkable durability and effectiveness. The walls at Tiryns, though located in the Peloponnese rather than central Greece, provide the most famous example of construction techniques that ancient sources attributed to Pelasgian builders. These massive stone fortifications, constructed with enormous limestone blocks fitted together without mortar, created defensive circuits that protected substantial urban populations and demonstrated mastery of megalithic construction methods. Similar construction techniques appear at numerous sites throughout central Greece, particularly in mountainous regions where natural stone provided abundant raw materials for defensive construction. The walls at Gla, located on a rocky outcrop in the Kopai basin of Boeotia, enclose an area of over 20 hectares and demonstrate planning and execution that required coordinated labour from substantial populations. The fortification circuit employs massive stone blocks, some weighing over 10 tons, arranged in courses that create walls reaching heights of over 6 metres in some sections. The distinctive characteristics of Pelasgian masonry, as identified by ancient sources and confirmed through archaeological investigation, include the use of irregularly shaped stone blocks fitted together with remarkable precision, the integration of defensive walls with natural topographic features, and the construction of complex gate systems that provided multiple lines of defence against attacking forces. These techniques required extensive knowledge of stoneworking, engineering principles, and military architecture that contradicts earlier assumptions about pre-Greek technological limitations. The labour organisation necessary for Pelasgian fortification projects suggests social and political structures capable of mobilising substantial human resources for extended construction periods. The walls at major sites like Gla would have required hundreds of workers labouring for several years, implying centralised authority capable of directing large-scale public works projects. The technical consistency of construction methods across different sites suggests standardised building traditions and possibly specialised craftsmen who travelled between communities to supervise major construction projects. Archaeological evidence from central Greek sites attributed to Pelasgian construction reveals settlement patterns that integrated defensive considerations with agricultural and commercial activities. The fortified sites typically controlled strategic mountain passes, river crossings, or other topographic features that provided military and economic advantages. Within the protected areas, excavations have uncovered residential districts, craft production areas, storage facilities, and religious precincts that demonstrate complex urban organisation and diverse economic activities. The relationship between Pelasgian populations and incoming Greek tribes, as documented in classical sources and supported by archaeological evidence, involved complex processes of conflict, accommodation, and cultural synthesis that varied significantly across different regions and time periods. In Thessaly, the process appears to have been relatively gradual, with archaeological evidence suggesting cultural blending rather than sudden population replacement. Pottery assemblages from transitional periods show mixtures of traditional Pelasgian forms with new styles introduced by Greek settlers, while burial practices demonstrate similar patterns of cultural accommodation. The persistence of Pelasgian place names throughout central Greece and Thessaly provides linguistic evidence for the extent and distribution of pre-Greek settlement. Toponyms featuring the characteristic suffixes ithos, essos, and ttos appear throughout the region, often associated with geographic features such as mountains, rivers, and prominent landmarks. The name Larissa, which appears multiple times across Thessaly, and was specifically associated with Pelasgian settlements in ancient sources, may derive from a pre-Greek root meaning a citadel or fortified place, reflecting the importance of defensive architecture in Pelasgian settlement patterns. River names throughout central Greece preserve particularly clear evidence of pre-Greek linguistic heritage, as hydronyms typically resist change during population transitions and linguistic shifts. The Peneus, Spercheios, and other major rivers bear names that resist Indo-European etymology and likely preserve Pelasgian linguistic elements. The distribution of these non-Greek hydronyms corresponds closely with areas where archaeological evidence documents pre-Greek settlement, supporting connections between linguistic and material culture evidence. The agricultural foundations of Pelasgian society in central Greece and Thessaly, as revealed through archaeological investigation, demonstrates sophisticated adaptation to diverse environmental conditions and the development of intensive cultivation techniques that supported substantial populations. The fertile plains of Thessaly provided ideal conditions for grain cultivation, while the mountainous regions of central Greece supported mixed farming systems that combined crop cultivation with animal husbandry and exploitation of wild resources. Archaeological evidence for Pelasgian agricultural practices includes specialized tools for cultivation and harvesting, storage facilities designed to preserve agricultural products, and settlement patterns that optimized access to diverse agricultural resources. The large pithoi found at many sites demonstrate sophisticated food storage techniques that enabled communities to maintain substantial grain reserves through seasonal variations and periodic crop failures. These storage capabilities suggest agricultural surpluses that supported craft specialization and enabled investment in monumental construction projects. The integration of agricultural and defensive considerations in Pelasgian settlement planning demonstrates strategic thinking that balanced economic productivity with military security. Many fortified sites controlled access to fertile agricultural areas while providing refuge for rural populations during periods of conflict. This settlement pattern suggests social and political organization that extended beyond individual communities to encompass broader territorial units with shared defensive and economic interests. The relationship between the Pelasgians and the Etruscans represents one of the most complex and debated topics in ancient Mediterranean studies, involving intricate questions of ethnicity, migration patterns, and cultural transmission that have challenged scholars for over 2 centuries. Ancient sources provide tantalizing hints about connections between these peoples, while modern archaeological and linguistic evidence offers both support and complications for theories linking Pelasgian populations to the origins of Etruscan civilization in central Italy. Herodotus presents the most detailed ancient account connecting Pelasgians to Etruscan origins through his description of Tyrrhenian migration from Lydia to Italy. According to his narrative, a portion of the Lydian population, led by Tyrrhenus, departed their homeland during a period of severe famine and eventually established themselves in the territory that would become known as Etruria. Herodotus explicitly identifies these migrants as the ancestors of the Etruscans, though his account focuses primarily on their Lydian origins rather than any intermediate Pelasgian connections. The historian's description of Tyrrhenian Pelasgians provides additional complexity to this migration narrative. He describes how certain Pelasgian groups, after being expelled from Attica, sailed to Lemnos and Imbros, where they established settlements and maintained their distinct cultural identity for several generations. From these Aegean bases, according to Herodotus, some Pelasgian groups engaged in maritime activities that brought them into contact with various Mediterranean populations, including communities along the Italian coast. Archaeological investigation of early Etruscan sites has revealed material culture elements that show striking parallels to artifacts found at Aegean sites associated with Pelasgian occupation. The settlement at Tarquinia, one of the most important early Etruscan centres, contains pottery assemblages from its earliest phases that display decorative motifs and manufacturing techniques remarkably similar to ceramics found on Lemnos and other Aegean islands. These vessels feature burnished surfaces decorated with incised geometric patterns, relief ornaments, and painted designs that employ colour schemes and compositional arrangements nearly identical to those found in Palastian contexts. The fortification techniques employed at early Etruscan sites demonstrate construction methods that parallel those attributed to Pelasgian builders in the Aegean region. The walls at Cosa, constructed during the early phases of Etruscan expansion, employ polygonal masonry techniques, using carefully fitted stone blocks arranged without mortar in patterns that closely resemble Pelasgian fortifications on Lemnos and in central Greece. The gate systems at these sites feature complex defensive arrangements with multiple chambers and overlapping fields of fire that suggest shared military architectural traditions. Burial practices documented in early Etruscan cemeteries show distinctive characteristics that align with funeral customs observed at Pelasgian sites in the Aegean. The cemetery at Cerveteri contains tombs from the 7th and 6th centuries BC that employ chamber construction techniques, grave good assemblages, and body positioning practices that parallel burial customs documented on Lemnos and other islands associated with Palastian occupation. Particularly significant are the practices of placing weapons with male burials and jewellery with female interments, arranged according to patterns that appear throughout Palastian archaeological contexts. The linguistic evidence connecting Etruscan to Palastian languages provides perhaps the most compelling support for theories proposing shared origins or cultural connections between these populations. Comparative analysis of the Lemnian inscriptions discovered in the 19th century revealed lexical and grammatical elements that show remarkable similarities to Etruscan linguistic structures. The personal names appearing on the Lemnian Stele display phonetic patterns and morphological characteristics that align closely with Etruscan onomastic traditions, suggesting genetic relationships between the languages rather than mere borrowing or coincidental similarity. Detailed examination of Etruscan and Lemnian verbal systems reveals shared characteristics in conjugation patterns, tense formations, and aspectual distinctions that indicate common ancestral sources for these linguistic traditions. Both languages employ agglutinative morphology with complex case systems that differ markedly from contemporary Indo-European languages of the Mediterranean region. The similarity extends to specific grammatical particles, conjunctions, and syntactic arrangements that suggest prolonged contact or common development rather than independent evolution. Religious terminology preserved in Etruscan inscriptions shows particularly striking parallels to vocabulary found in the Lemnian texts. Divine epithets, ritual formulae, and ceremonial expressions display lexical correspondences that extend beyond chance similarity to suggest shared religious traditions and theological concepts. The Etruscan term civae, appearing in religious contexts throughout central Italy, corresponds directly to similar expressions found on the Lemnian Stele, indicating common religious vocabulary that likely reflects shared cult practices and divine concepts. The geographic distribution of related linguistic elements extends beyond Etruria and Lemnos to include areas of the Alpine region where Rhaetic inscriptions display similar characteristics to both Etruscan and Lemnian texts. These inscriptions, found primarily in the valleys of the Eastern Alps, employ alphabetic scripts derived from Etruscan models, but preserve linguistic elements that show connections to the broader Ticenian language family. The presence of related languages across such extensive geographic areas suggests either large-scale migration patterns or the existence of a linguistic continuum that once extended across much of Central Europe and the Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout the Ticenian linguistic area reveals material culture traditions that support theories of cultural connections between Pelasgian and Etruscan populations. Pottery styles, metalworking techniques, and architectural practices show consistent characteristics across regions where related languages have been documented, suggesting shared cultural traditions that accompanied linguistic relationships. The distribution of these cultural elements follows patterns that align with proposed migration routes connecting the Aegean region to central Italy through alpine passes and coastal navigation routes. The chronological framework for proposed Pelasgian Etruscan connections requires careful consideration of archaeological dating evidence and historical accounts of population movements in the Mediterranean during the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age periods. Radiocarbon dating from early Etruscan sites indicates initial settlement phases during the 9th and 8th centuries BC, while comparable dating from Pelasgian sites in the Aegean suggests contemporary occupation periods that could support theories of migration or cultural contact during this time frame. The process of cultural transmission between Aegean Pelasgian populations and emerging Etruscan communities appears to have involved complex patterns of maritime contact, gradual migration, and technological exchange rather than single large-scale population movements. Archaeological evidence suggests that cultural elements associated with Pelasgian traditions appeared in central Italy over extended periods, indicating sustained contact between Mediterranean populations rather than sudden demographic replacement. Maritime archaeological evidence supports theories of extensive sea-based contact between the Aegean region and central Italy during the periods when Pelasgian and early Etruscan cultures flourished. Shipwreck discoveries throughout the Mediterranean contain cargo assemblages that demonstrate regular commercial exchange between these regions, including pottery, metalwork, and raw materials that facilitated cultural transmission alongside economic relationships. The strategic position of islands like Lemnos along major shipping routes provided natural stopping points for vessels engaged in long-distance Mediterranean commerce. The technological innovations documented in early Etruscan metalworking show clear connections to techniques developed in the Aegean region during the Bronze Age. Etruscan bronze production employed specialized alloy compositions, casting methods, and decorative techniques that parallel innovations found at Pelasgian sites on Lemnos and other Aegean islands. The sophistication of these technologies suggests direct transmission of technical knowledge rather than independent development, supporting theories of cultural contact between Pelasgian and Etruscan craftsmen. Religious practices documented in early Etruscan contexts display characteristics that align with evidence for Pelasgian cult traditions in the Aegean. Sanctuary sites in Etruria feature architectural layouts, votive offering practices, and divine iconography that show remarkable similarities to religious installations found at Pelasgian sites. The emphasis on chthonic deities, fertility cults, and ritual practices involving fire and water parallels religious traditions documented in Pelasgian archaeological contexts, suggesting shared theological concepts and ceremonial practices. The integration of Pelasgian religious elements into Etruscan spiritual traditions appears to have involved synthesis with local Italian religious practices and influences from other Mediterranean cultures rather than simple adoption of foreign customs. Etruscan religious art displays iconographic elements that combine Aegean traditions with indigenous Italian motifs and influences from contemporary Greek and Phoenician sources, creating distinctive artistic traditions that reflected complex cultural interactions. The political organisation of early Etruscan communities shows structural characteristics that parallel evidence for Pelasgian social organisation in the Aegean region. Both cultures appear to have employed confederate systems that linked autonomous city-states through shared religious practices, commercial relationships, and military alliances while maintaining local political independence. The Etruscan League of 12 cities resembles organisational patterns documented for Pelasgian communities, suggesting shared political traditions that may reflect common cultural origins. Archaeological evidence for craft specialisation and economic organisation in early Etruscan contexts reveals production systems and trade relationships that show clear connections to patterns documented at Pelasgian sites. The organisation of pottery workshops, metalworking facilities and textile production centres in Etruscan settlements employs spatial arrangements and technological systems that parallel installations found in Pelasgian archaeological contexts. These similarities suggest transmission of economic organisational knowledge alongside technological innovations. The artistic traditions that emerged in early Etruscan communities incorporated decorative motifs, compositional arrangements, and iconographic elements that show clear relationships to artistic traditions documented in Pelasgian contexts. Painted tomb decorations, ceramic ornamentation, and metalwork designs employ stylistic elements that appear throughout Aegean sites associated with Pelasgian occupation. The consistency of these artistic connections across different media and contexts suggests sustained cultural relationships rather than superficial borrowing of decorative elements. The linguistic substrata preserved in later Latin vocabulary include elements that may derive from Ticenian languages related to both Etruscan and Pelasgian linguistic traditions. Certain Latin words, particularly those related to agriculture, architecture, and religious practices, resist Indo-European etymology and show phonetic characteristics that suggest borrowing from pre-Indo-European languages of the Italian peninsula. These substrate elements provide additional evidence for the influence of Ticenian-speaking populations on the cultural development of central Italy. The persistence of cultural elements associated with Pelasgian traditions in later Etruscan civilization suggests that connections between these populations involved substantial cultural transmission rather than superficial contact. Religious practices, artistic traditions, and technological innovations that can be traced to Pelasgian origins continue to influence Etruscan development throughout their historical period, indicating deep cultural relationships that shaped fundamental aspects of Etruscan civilization. The religious landscape of Pelasgian civilization reveals a complex tapestry of beliefs and practices that fundamentally shaped the spiritual development of the ancient Mediterranean world. Archaeological evidence and classical testimonies converge to present a picture of sophisticated theological systems that predated and profoundly influenced later Greek religious traditions. The Pelasgians maintained sacred sites that functioned as centres of divine communication, employed ritual practices that emphasised direct communion with natural forces, and worshipped deities whose characteristics would later be absorbed into the classical Greek pantheon. The oracle at Dodona stands as the most significant testament to Pelasgian religious innovation and its enduring influence on Mediterranean spirituality. Located in the mountainous region of Epirus, this sanctuary operated continuously from the Bronze Age through the Roman period, making it one of the longest functioning religious centres in European history. Archaeological excavations have revealed Bronze Age deposits beneath the classical temple foundations, containing pottery fragments, bronze votives, and ritual implements that demonstrate religious activity predating Greek settlement by several centuries. The distinctive oracular practices at Dodona reflected theological concepts that differed markedly from later Greek religious traditions. Rather than Relying on human intermediaries who claimed direct divine possession, the Palastian priests interpreted divine messages through careful observation of natural phenomena associated with the sacred oak grove. The rustling of leaves in the wind, the sounds produced by bronze vessels suspended from tree branches, and the flight patterns of sacred doves all served as vehicles for divine communication. This approach to divination emphasized the immanence of divine forces within the natural world, rather than their transcendent separation from earthly existence. Herodotus provides detailed descriptions of the religious personnel who maintained Dodona's oracular functions during its early phases. He identifies the original priests as Stele, men who practiced ritual purity through specific behavioral restrictions, including sleeping on the ground and never washing their feet. These ascetic practices suggest religious traditions that emphasized physical communion with the earth and rejection of conventional comfort, reflecting theological concepts that viewed the natural world as inherently sacred rather than merely a reflection of divine will. The sacred oak trees themselves functioned as the primary focus of religious activity at Dodona, with specific trees being regarded as particularly potent channels for divine communication. Ancient sources describe how certain oaks were believed to possess the ability to speak directly to human questioners, providing answers to inquiries about personal decisions, political policies, and religious obligations. The priests maintained these trees through careful cultivation and protection, ensuring their health and longevity through practices that combined practical arboriculture with ritual observances. The bronze vessels suspended from the oak branches served both practical and symbolic functions within the oracular system. These carefully crafted objects, produced by skilled metal workers using techniques that required extensive technical knowledge, created specific acoustic effects when moved by wind currents. The resulting sounds were interpreted by the priests according to complex systems of meaning that had been developed over generations of religious practice. Archaeological recovery of these bronze implements reveals sophisticated manufacturing techniques and decorative programs that suggest their production required specialized craftsmen working within established religious traditions. The sacred doves of Dodona played equally important roles in the oracular process, with their behavior being carefully observed and interpreted according to established religious protocols. These birds, which nested within the oak grove and were protected by religious sanctions, provided additional channels for divine communication through their flight patterns, vocalizations, and nesting behaviors. The priests maintained detailed knowledge of dove behavior and developed interpretive systems that could extract meaningful guidance from seemingly random avian activities. Archaeological evidence from Dodona reveals the presence of numerous votive offerings that demonstrate the sanctuary's appeal to worshippers from across the Mediterranean world. Bronze figurines depicting human figures in various poses of supplication, ceramic vessels containing food offerings, and inscribed tablets recording questions posed to the oracle illustrate the diversity of religious practices associated with the site. The geographic origins of these offerings, determined through stylistic analysis and materials identification, indicate that Dodona attracted pilgrims from regions extending from southern Italy to the Black Sea coast. The architectural development of Dodona reflects the evolution of Pelasgian religious practices and their gradual integration with Greek traditions following political conquest of the region. The earliest phases of the sanctuary featured minimal built structures, with religious activity centered around the natural oak grove and simple altars constructed from local stone. Subsequent building phases introduced more elaborate architectural elements, while maintaining the essential focus on the sacred trees, suggesting accommodation between indigenous religious traditions and incoming Greek architectural preferences. The mystery cults associated with Palastian religious traditions present another significant aspect of their spiritual heritage that influenced later Mediterranean religious development. The sanctuary of the great gods on Samothrace, traditionally attributed to Palastian foundation, operated elaborate initiation ceremonies that attracted participants from throughout the ancient world. These mysteries involved complex ritual sequences that promised initiates special protection and spiritual benefits, employing ceremonial practices that differed substantially from conventional Greek religious observances. Archaeological investigation of the Samothracian sanctuary has revealed architectural complexes specifically designed to accommodate mystery cult activities, including underground chambers for secret ceremonies, elaborate bathing facilities for ritual purification, and assembly halls capable of accommodating large numbers of initiates. The construction techniques employed in these buildings demonstrate sophisticated engineering knowledge and suggest substantial financial resources devoted to religious architecture, indicating the economic importance of mystery cult activities to the island's population. The initiation ceremonies at Samothrace involved ritual sequences that emphasized personal transformation and spiritual rebirth through symbolic death and resurrection experiences. Initiates underwent purification procedures that included ritual bathing, fasting, and confession of personal transgressions before participating in secret ceremonies that promised divine protection and posthumous rewards. These practices required extensive preparation and substantial financial contributions, limiting participation to individuals with sufficient wealth and social status to meet the cult's requirements. The deities worshipped in Palastian religious contexts display characteristics that distinguish them from later Greek divine figures, while showing clear connections to broader Mediterranean religious traditions. Archaeological evidence suggests that Palastian religious practices emphasized chthonic deities associated with earth, fertility, and the underworld rather than the sky gods that dominated later Greek religious systems. The great goddess figure that appears throughout Palastian religious art displays iconographic characteristics that connect her to similar divine figures found across the ancient Near East and Anatolia. These representations typically feature the goddess in poses that emphasize her role as Earth Mother and fertility provider, often accompanied by animal symbols including serpents, birds, and bulls that reinforce her connections to natural cycles and agricultural abundance. The consistency of these iconographic elements across different Palastian sites suggests shared religious traditions that transcended local political boundaries. Male deities in Palastian religious contexts often appear as consorts or subordinate figures to the dominant goddess, reflecting theological systems that emphasized feminine divine power rather than the patriarchal arrangements characteristic of later Greek religion. Archaeological evidence suggests that these male figures frequently represented seasonal cycles, vegetation spirits, or underworld powers that complemented the goddess's fertility functions. The ritual practices associated with these deities often involved ceremonies that celebrated agricultural cycles and ensured continued natural abundance. The sacred sites associated with Palastian religious practices demonstrate consistent preferences for locations that exploited natural features such as springs, caves, prominent rock formations, and groves of ancient trees. These sites typically show evidence for continuous religious use over extended periods, suggesting that their sacred character derived from inherent natural properties rather than human architectural achievements. The persistence of religious activity at such locations through multiple cultural transitions indicates the power of natural sacred spaces to maintain their spiritual significance. Despite political and demographic changes, cave sanctuaries throughout the Palastian cultural area preserve evidence for religious practices that involved offerings to chthonic deities and communion with underworld powers. The cave of Psychro on Crete, traditionally associated with the birth of Zeus but showing evidence for much earlier religious activity, contains Bronze Age deposits that include pottery vessels, bronze objects, and organic materials that appear to represent offerings to earth deities. The specific arrangement of these deposits within the cave's chambers suggests ritual practices that exploited the natural acoustics and atmospheric conditions of underground spaces. Spring sanctuaries represent another significant category of Pelasgian religious sites, with natural water sources being regarded as manifestations of divine power and channels for communication with supernatural forces. Archaeological investigation of spring sites throughout the Pelasgian cultural area has revealed consistent patterns of votive offerings and ritual activities that demonstrate shared religious traditions centered on water worship. These practices often involve the deposition of valuable objects including jewellery, weapons, and ceramic vessels in spring pools, creating underwater votive deposits that accumulated over centuries of religious observance. The ritual implements associated with Pelasgian religious practices reveal sophisticated understanding of ceremonial requirements and the material culture necessary to support complex religious observances. Bronze vessels designed specifically for ritual use display distinctive forms and decorative programs that distinguish them from utilitarian objects, suggesting specialized craft production devoted to religious purposes. These ceremonial vessels often feature elaborate handles shaped as animal figures, decorative elements that incorporate religious symbols, and surface treatments that create specific acoustic or visual effects during ritual use. Libation practices formed a central component of Pelasgian religious observances, with archaeological evidence indicating regular offerings of wine, oil, milk, and other liquids to divine powers. Specialized vessels designed for libation activities demonstrate sophisticated understanding of fluid dynamics and ceremonial requirements, with forms that facilitated controlled pouring and decorative programs that enhanced the visual impact of ritual activities. The recovery of these vessels from religious contexts throughout the Pelasgian cultural area suggests standardized ritual practices that maintain consistency across different communities and time periods. The astronomical knowledge demonstrated in Pelasgian religious practices indicates sophisticated understanding of celestial cycles and their integration with agricultural and religious calendars. Several sacred sites show architectural orientations that align with significant astronomical events, including solstices, equinoxes, and the rising of important star groups. These alignments suggest that Pelasgian religious practices incorporated precise observation of celestial phenomena and used astronomical knowledge to determine appropriate timing for religious ceremonies and agricultural activities. The calendar systems employed in Pelasgian religious contexts appear to have combined lunar and solar observations with agricultural cycles to create complex temporal frameworks that coordinated religious observances with seasonal activities. Archaeological evidence suggests that major religious festivals occurred at specific points in the agricultural year, with ceremonies designed to ensure divine support for planting, growing, and harvesting activities. These religious calendars required sophisticated mathematical knowledge and careful observation of natural phenomena, indicating advanced intellectual traditions within Pelasgian religious communities. The influence of Pelasgian religious traditions on later Greek spiritual development appears throughout classical religious practices, mythological narratives, and sacred site locations. Many of the most important Greek religious centres, including Delphi, Olympia, and Eleusis, show evidence for pre-Greek religious activity that provided foundations for later classical developments. The continuity of religious function at these sites suggests that Greek religious traditions incorporated and adapted Pelasgian spiritual practices rather than completely replacing them with new religious systems. The mythological narratives preserved in later Greek literature contain numerous references to Pelasgian religious traditions and their role in establishing divine worship in various locations. These stories often describe Pelasgian priests as the original founders of sacred sites and the introducers of specific religious practices that continue to characterize these locations throughout the classical period. While these narratives obviously contain legendary elements, they preserve cultural memories of pre-Greek religious traditions and their contributions to the development of classical spirituality. The theological concepts embedded in Palastian religious practices demonstrate sophisticated understanding of divine human relationships and the role of religious observance in maintaining cosmic order. The emphasis on natural phenomena as vehicles for divine communication suggests theological systems that view the material world as inherently sacred rather than merely as a reflection of transcendent divine will. This approach to religious understanding influenced the development of Greek philosophical traditions and contributed to the emergence of naturalistic approaches to divine knowledge that characterized later Mediterranean intellectual development. The material remains of Pelasgian civilization provide the most tangible evidence for understanding their technological capabilities, artistic traditions, and daily life practices. Archaeological excavations across the Aegean and Mediterranean regions have uncovered extensive assemblages of pottery, metalwork, architectural fragments, and domestic implements that reveal sophisticated craft traditions and technological innovations that predated and influenced later Greek material culture. These artifacts demonstrate that Pelasgian communities possessed advanced manufacturing capabilities and maintained extensive trade networks that facilitated the exchange of both raw materials and finished goods across considerable distances. Pottery production among Pelasgian populations achieved remarkable levels of technical sophistication and artistic achievement, with ceramic traditions that displayed distinctive characteristics while showing regional variations across their cultural sphere. The pottery assemblages from Lemnos demonstrate particularly advanced manufacturing techniques, including the use of specialized clay preparations that incorporated volcanic ash to create vessels with exceptional durability and distinctive surface textures. These ceramics feature carefully controlled firing procedures that produce consistent color schemes and surface finishes, indicating systematic knowledge of kiln operation and temperature management that required generations of accumulated technical expertise. The decorative programs employed on Pelasgian pottery reveal complex symbolic systems and artistic traditions that distinguish their ceramic production from contemporary Mediterranean cultures. Vessels from sites across the Aegean display consistent use of geometric patterns, stylized animal figures, and abstract motifs that appear to have carried specific cultural meanings. The incised decorations frequently feature spirals, meanders, and interlocking patterns that were executed with remarkable precision, using specialized tools that created uniform line widths and consistent spacing. These decorative techniques required skilled craftsmen who possessed both artistic ability and technical knowledge of ceramic surface treatment. Relief ornamentation on Pelasgian pottery demonstrates advanced understanding of clay manipulation and three-dimensional design principles. Large storage vessels, or pithoi, from Thessalian sites feature applied decorative elements that include human figures, animal representations, and architectural motifs executed with sophisticated modelling techniques. These relief decorations were created by applying separately formed clay elements to vessel surfaces before firing, requiring precise timing and moisture control to ensure proper adhesion and prevent cracking during the drying and firing processes. The functional pottery types produced by Pelasgian craftsmen reveal detailed understanding of vessel performance requirements and user needs. Cooking pots display carefully designed rim forms that facilitated efficient heat transfer while preventing spillage during food preparation. Storage vessels feature internal surface treatments that reduced permeability and prevented contamination of stored contents. Serving vessels demonstrate attention to ergonomic considerations with handle placements and rim shapes that enhanced usability while maintaining aesthetic appeal. Metalworking technologies employed by Pelasgian artisans achieved levels of sophistication that rivaled contemporary Bronze Age civilizations throughout the Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence from workshop contexts reveals complex production sequences that began with ore processing and extended through alloy preparation, casting, and finishing procedures. The bronze objects recovered from Pelasgian sites demonstrate mastery of advanced metallurgical techniques, including lost wax casting, which enabled the production of complex three-dimensional forms with intricate decorative details that could not be achieved through simpler manufacturing methods. The alloy compositions used in Pelasgian bronze production show systematic variation according to intended function, with tools and weapons employing different copper-tin ratios than decorative objects or ritual implements. Chemical analysis of bronze artifacts reveals that Pelasgian metalworkers possessed detailed knowledge of how alloy composition affected material properties, enabling them to optimize metal performance for specific applications. Weapons typically employed harder alloys with higher tin content that provided superior edge retention, while decorative objects used softer alloys that facilitated detailed surface ornamentation and complex forming procedures. The casting techniques employed in Pelasgian metalworking demonstrate sophisticated understanding of mould design and metal flow characteristics. Bronze vessels recovered from various sites show evidence for piece mould casting procedures that enabled the production of complex forms with undercuts and internal features that could not be achieved through simple open mould techniques. The surface quality of cast objects indicates careful mould preparation and controlled pouring procedures that minimized defects and produced finished objects requiring minimal post-casting treatment. Decorative metalworking techniques employed by Pelasgian craftsmen included engraving, repoussé work, and inlay procedures that created elaborate surface ornaments on both functional and ceremonial objects. Bronze mirrors from Lemnian contexts feature engraved decorations executed with remarkable precision, displaying geometric patterns and figural representations that demonstrate advanced understanding of metal surface treatment. The consistency of decorative motifs across different object types suggests standardized artistic traditions and possibly specialized workshops that produced objects for distribution throughout Pelasgian cultural areas. The architectural traditions documented at Pelasgian sites reveal construction techniques and design principles that influence subsequent Mediterranean building practices. The fortification systems at Polyochni on Lemnos demonstrate sophisticated understanding of defensive architecture and engineering principles that enable the construction of walls capable of withstanding both military assault and seismic activity. These defensive works employed carefully selected basalt blocks, arranged in courses that distributed structural loads effectively, while creating walls of impressive height and thickness. The construction techniques employed in Pelasgian fortifications involved the use of polygonal masonry that fitted irregularly shaped stone blocks together with remarkable precision. This building method required skilled stonemasons who possessed detailed knowledge of stoneworking techniques and geometric principles that enabled them to create stable structures without the use of mortar. The blocks were shaped using bronze tools and abrasive materials that produced precisely fitted joints capable of maintaining structural integrity through centuries of weathering and ground movement. Gate systems in Pelasgian fortifications demonstrate advanced understanding of defensive architecture and traffic control principles. The entrances at major sites feature complex arrangements with multiple chambers, overlapping defensive positions, and carefully controlled sight lines that provided maximum protection for defenders while limiting the effectiveness of attacking forces. These gate designs required sophisticated planning and engineering knowledge that coordinated structural requirements with military tactical considerations. The residential architecture documented within Pelasgian settlements reveals social organization patterns and domestic life practices that distinguish their communities from contemporary Mediterranean cultures. Houses at Polyochni display consistent planning principles with a central courtyard surrounded by rooms arranged according to functional requirements. The larger residences feature multiple storage areas, specialized workspaces, and evidence for craft production activities that indicate household economic diversification beyond basic subsistence activities. Construction techniques employed in domestic architecture demonstrate efficient use of available materials and adaptation to local environmental conditions. Walls typically employed stone foundations, with mud brick superstructures that provided effective insulation, while utilising readily available raw materials. Roof systems used timber framing with clay tile covering that shed rainwater effectively, while providing protection from wind and temperature extremes. These construction methods required coordinated labour and materials procurement that indicates organised building trades and resource management systems. The distinctive building techniques attributed to Pelasgian construction, particularly the massive stone walls known as Pelasgian walls, represent some of the most impressive architectural achievements of Bronze Age Mediterranean civilization. These fortification systems, found at sites throughout Greece and the Aegean, employ construction methods that required sophisticated engineering knowledge and organisational capabilities that enabled the coordination of large-scale building projects. The walls at Tiryns, though located outside the primary Pelasgian cultural area, exemplify the construction techniques that ancient sources attributed to Pelasgian builders. The megalithic construction methods employed in Pelasgian wall building involved the quarrying, transport and placement of stone blocks weighing several tons each. These operations required specialised tools, transport equipment and lifting devices that enabled work crews to handle massive stone elements with precision and safety. Archaeological evidence suggests that Pelasgian builders employed bronze tools, wooden levers and rope systems that facilitated the movement and positioning of large blocks during construction activities. The planning and layout of Pelasgian fortification systems demonstrates sophisticated understanding of military architecture and topographic analysis. Wall circuits typically exploited natural defensive features while providing comprehensive protection for enclosed settlements. The positioning of defensive works took advantage of elevation changes, rocky outcrops and water sources that enhanced defensive capabilities while minimising construction requirements. These design decisions required detailed site analysis and strategic planning that coordinated military considerations with practical construction constraints. Burial practices documented in Pelasgian cemeteries reveal complex social organisation patterns and religious beliefs that distinguish their communities from contemporary Mediterranean cultures. The cemetery at Polyokone contains burials spanning several centuries that demonstrate consistent funeral customs and grave good assemblages. Adult burials typically feature extended inhumation, with the deceased positioned according to specific orientations that may reflect cosmological beliefs about afterlife journeys or seasonal cycles. The grave goods associated with Pelasgian burials provide insights into social stratification, craft specialization, and trade relationships that characterize their communities. Wealthy burials contain elaborate assemblages including bronze weapons, jewelry, ceramic vessels, and imported objects that demonstrate participation in extensive exchange networks. The quality and variety of grave goods indicates significant differences in wealth and social status within Pelasgian communities, suggesting hierarchical social organisation with clear distinctions between elite and common populations. Infant and child burial practices in Pelasgian contexts display distinctive characteristics that reflect specific beliefs about childhood, death, and spiritual protection. Young individuals were frequently interred in large ceramic vessels, or pithoi, that were buried beneath house floors or in designated cemetery areas. This practice, documented throughout the Eastern Mediterranean during the Bronze Age, shows local variations in Pelasgian contexts that suggest indigenous cultural development rather than simple adoption of foreign customs. The positioning and orientation of pithos burials within Pelasgian settlements indicate careful attention to spatial relationships and possible connections to domestic religious practices. Many infant burials occur near hearth areas or storage facilities, suggesting beliefs about spiritual protection and continued connection between deceased children and living family members. The ceramic vessels used for these burials often display distinctive decorative programs that may have carried protective or religious significance. Adult burial orientations in Pelasgian cemeteries show consistent patterns that suggest shared beliefs about proper funeral procedures and afterlife concepts. The majority of burials feature head orientations towards specific cardinal directions, with variations that may reflect seasonal timing of death, social status, or individual religious preferences. The consistency of these practices across different sites indicates standardized funeral traditions that maintain cultural continuity despite geographic separation. Agricultural practices documented in Pelasgian contexts reveal sophisticated understanding of crop cultivation, soil management, and food storage techniques that supported substantial urban populations. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites includes specialized agricultural tools, storage facilities, and processing equipment that demonstrate intensive cultivation methods adapted to diverse environmental conditions. The agricultural implements recovered from various sites show consistent design principles and manufacturing techniques that suggest standardized tool traditions and possibly specialized craft production. Plough technology employed in Pelasgian agriculture demonstrates advanced understanding of soil cultivation principles and animal traction systems. Bronze ploughshares recovered from agricultural contexts show sophisticated design features that enhance soil penetration and furrow formation while reducing draft requirements. These implements required skilled metal workers who understood both agricultural requirements and metallurgical techniques necessary to produce durable, effective tools. Storage facilities documented at Pelasgian sites reveal systematic approaches to food preservation and resource management that enabled communities to maintain substantial reserves through seasonal variations and periodic crop failures. Large ceramic storage vessels, or pithoi, were manufactured with specific design features that optimize preservation conditions for different types of agricultural products. Grain storage vessels feature narrow openings and internal surface treatments that reduced moisture penetration and prevented insect infestation. The organization of storage facilities within Pelasgian settlements indicates centralized resource management systems that coordinated agricultural production with community consumption requirements. Storage areas typically occupy protected positions within fortified sites and feature architectural arrangements that facilitated efficient loading, monitoring, and distribution of stored products. These organizational patterns suggest administrative systems that tracked agricultural production and managed resource allocation according to community needs. Settlement patterns documented across the Pelasgian cultural area reveal strategic considerations that balanced agricultural productivity with defensive requirements and trade opportunities. Major settlements typically occupied elevated positions that provided natural defensive advantages while maintaining access to fertile agricultural areas and transportation routes. The distribution of settlements within regional systems indicates hierarchical organization, with larger centers controlling surrounding agricultural territories and smaller communities. The relationship between settlement location and resource access demonstrates sophisticated understanding of environmental conditions and economic opportunities available in different geographic settings. Coastal settlements exploited marine resources and maritime trade opportunities while maintaining agricultural production in nearby inland areas. Mountain settlements controlled strategic passes and mineral resources while developing specialized economies based on pastoralism and craft production using locally available raw materials. Trade relationships documented through artifact distribution patterns reveal extensive exchange networks that connected Pelasgian communities with populations throughout the Mediterranean region. Imported objects found at Pelasgian sites include pottery from Anatolia, metal objects from Central Europe, and raw materials from distant sources that demonstrate participation in long-distance commercial relationships. These trade connections facilitated technological transfer and cultural exchange that influenced Pelasgian material culture development. The production of trade goods for export markets indicates specialized craft industries that generated surplus products for exchange with foreign communities. Pelasgian pottery, metalwork, and textiles appear at sites throughout the Aegean region, suggesting that their craftsmen produced objects specifically designed for external markets. These export industries required quality control systems and standardized production methods that maintained consistent product characteristics across different workshops and time periods. The arrival of Greek-speaking populations in the Aegean basin during the Late Bronze Age initiated a complex process of cultural interaction that would fundamentally transform the demographic and cultural landscape of the region. Archaeological evidence suggests this process began around 2000 BC with the gradual infiltration of Indo-European speaking groups, who brought with them distinctive pottery styles, burial customs, and linguistic traditions that would eventually dominate the Eastern Mediterranean. The interaction between these newcomers and established Pelasgian populations unfolded over several centuries through patterns of conflict, accommodation, and gradual assimilation that varied significantly across different regions and time periods. The earliest phases of Greek settlement appear to have occurred in mainland Greece, particularly in the fertile plains of Thessaly and the coastal regions of the Peloponnese, where incoming populations established fortified settlements that controlled strategic river valleys and agricultural territories. Archaeological evidence from sites like Lerna, in the Argolid, reveals destruction layers dating to approximately 2200 BC, followed by the appearance of new pottery styles and architectural techniques that mark the beginning of what archaeologists term the Middle Helladic period. These material culture changes coincide with the first appearance of Greek place names and suggest the initial establishment of Greek-speaking communities in regions previously occupied by pre-Greek populations. The process of cultural assimilation between Pelasgians and Greeks appears to have been gradual and regionally variable, with some areas experiencing rapid demographic replacement, while others maintained mixed populations for several centuries. In Attica, archaeological evidence suggests a more complex pattern of interaction, with Pelasgian communities continuing to occupy mountainous regions around the future site of Athens, while Greek settlers established themselves in the more accessible coastal plains. Pottery assemblages from sites like the Athenian Agora show gradual transitions in ceramic styles that suggest cultural blending rather than sudden population replacement. The fortified settlement of Aegina provides particularly clear evidence for the coexistence of Pelasgian and Greek populations during the transitional period. Excavations have revealed architectural remains that display construction techniques attributed to Pelasgian builders, alongside pottery assemblages that include both traditional pre-Greek forms and new styles associated with incoming Greek populations. The stratigraphic sequence at the site demonstrates continuous occupation through the transition period, with gradual changes in material culture that suggest cultural accommodation rather than violent conquest. Intermarriage between Pelasgian and Greek populations appears to have played a crucial role in the assimilation process, creating mixed communities that combined elements from both cultural traditions. Greek genealogical traditions preserved in later mythological accounts frequently describe marriages between Greek heroes and Pelasgian princesses, suggesting that such unions carried significant political and social importance in establishing legitimacy for Greek rule over formerly Pelasgian territories. The consistency of these marriage narratives across different regional traditions indicates that intermarriage represented a widespread phenomenon rather than isolated occurrences. Archaeological evidence for intermarriage appears in burial practices that combine elements from both cultural traditions. Cemeteries from transitional periods often contain graves that employ Pelasgian burial orientations and grave good arrangements alongside Greek pottery styles and weapon types. The cemetery at Marathon in Attica demonstrates this cultural blending, with burials dating to the Middle Helladic period showing mixed assemblages that include traditional Pelasgian ceramic forms decorated with new motifs introduced by Greek settlers. The linguistic evidence for Greek-Pelasgian interaction reveals complex patterns of borrowing and substrate influence that affected both vocabulary and phonetic systems. Greek dialects spoken in regions with substantial pre-Greek populations show distinctive characteristics that likely derive from Pelasgian linguistic influence. The Aeolic dialects of Thessaly and Lesbos, for example, display phonetic features and grammatical constructions that differ from other Greek dialect groups and may reflect substrate influence from pre-Greek languages spoken in these regions before Greek settlement. Place-name evidence provides the clearest documentation of linguistic interaction between Greek and Pelasgian populations. Many Greek settlements bear names that resist Indo-European etymology and likely preserve pre-Greek linguistic elements. The name Athens itself may derive from a pre-Greek root, while numerous other Attic toponyms display the characteristic suffixes associated with pre-Indo-European languages. The persistence of these place names through the Greek settlement period suggests that incoming populations adopted existing geographic terminology rather than completely replacing it with Greek equivalents. Hydronyms throughout the Greek world preserve particularly clear evidence of pre-Greek linguistic heritage, as river names typically resist change during population transitions. Major rivers like the Kephisos in Attica, the Peneos in Thessaly, and the Alpheos in the Peloponnese bear names that show no clear Indo-European etymology and likely preserve Pelasgian linguistic elements. The distribution of these non-Greek river names corresponds closely with regions where classical sources placed Pelasgian populations, supporting connections between linguistic and historical evidence. The religious sphere provided another crucial area of cultural interaction between Pelasgians and Greeks, with many sacred sites showing continuity of function through the transition period, despite changes in the specific deities worshipped and ritual practices employed. The sanctuary at Dodona exemplifies this religious continuity, with archaeological evidence demonstrating continuous religious activity from the Bronze Age through the Classical period. The oracular practices associated with the site retained their distinctive characteristics while being gradually incorporated into Greek religious systems through the identification of the local deity with Zeus. The mystery cult at Eleusis provides another example of religious syncretism between Pelasgian and Greek traditions. Archaeological evidence indicates pre-Greek religious activity at the site, with Bronze Age deposits containing votive offerings and ritual implements that predate the classical Demeter cult by several centuries. The distinctive characteristics of the Eleusinian mysteries, particularly their emphasis on agricultural fertility and chthonic deities, suggest the incorporation of pre-Greek religious traditions within Greek theological frameworks. Sacred sites throughout Attica show similar patterns of religious continuity, with gradual adaptation to Greek religious practices. The sanctuary of Artemis Brauronia at Brauron contains Bronze Age deposits that indicate pre-Greek religious activity, while the cult practices documented in later periods retain distinctive characteristics that may derive from pre-Greek traditions. The emphasis on female initiation rites and bear symbolism at Brauron differs markedly from typical Greek religious practices and may preserve elements of Pelasgian religious traditions. The economic integration of Pelasgian and Greek populations appears to have facilitated cultural assimilation through the development of complementary production systems and trade relationships. Archaeological evidence suggests that Pelasgian communities maintained specialized craft traditions, particularly in metalworking and pottery production, that continued to supply Greek settlements with high-quality manufactured goods. The distinctive bronze-working techniques attributed to Pelasgian craftsmen appear in objects found at Greek sites, suggesting continued production by Pelasgian artisans working within Greek-controlled territories. Agricultural practices provide evidence for technological transfer from Pelasgian to Greek populations, with incoming Greek settlers adopting cultivation techniques and crop varieties that had been developed by pre-Greek populations over centuries of local adaptation. The terracing systems found throughout the Greek islands show construction techniques that predate Greek settlement and likely represent Pelasgian agricultural innovations that were maintained and expanded by later Greek farmers. These agricultural systems required detailed knowledge of local soil conditions, rainfall patterns, and crop requirements that could only be acquired through long experience in specific environmental settings. The process of Hellenization varied significantly across different regions, with some areas maintaining distinct Pelasgian cultural elements well into the historical period, while others experienced more complete cultural transformation. The island of Lemnos provides the most dramatic example of prolonged cultural resistance, with Pelasgian populations maintaining their distinctive language and customs until the Athenian conquest in the 6th century BC. The survival of the Lemnian language for over a millennium after the initial Greek settlement of the Aegean demonstrates the possibility for cultural persistence under favourable geographic and political conditions. Samothrace presents another example of cultural persistence, with the mystery cult of the great gods maintaining distinctive characteristics that ancient sources attributed to Pelasgian origins. The ritual practices documented at the sanctuary combined elements that appear to derive from pre-Greek traditions with Greek religious innovations, creating syncretic cult practices that attracted initiates from throughout the Mediterranean world. The international appeal of the Samothracian mysteries may have derived partly from their preservation of ancient religious traditions that predated conventional Greek religious practices. The incorporation of Pelasgian populations into Greek political systems appears to have varied according to local circumstances and the specific mechanisms of Greek conquest or settlement. In some regions, Pelasgian communities appear to have maintained semi-autonomous status under Greek hegemony, continuing to practice traditional customs while acknowledging Greek political authority. Archaeological evidence from Aegean suggests this type of arrangement, with material culture showing gradual Greek influence, while maintaining distinctive local characteristics that may reflect continued Pelasgian cultural identity. The legal status of Pelasgian populations within Greek communities remains difficult to determine from available evidence, though classical sources provide some indications of their social position. Herodotus describes Pelasgian communities in Attica as occupying specific districts and maintaining their own customs under Athenian authority, suggesting a form of protected minority status that allowed cultural continuity while acknowledging Greek political control. The eventual expulsion of these communities, as described by classical historians, indicates that their legal position remained precarious and subject to changing political circumstances. Military service appears to have provided one avenue for Pelasgian integration into Greek society, with evidence suggesting that Pelasgian warriors served in Greek armies and may have achieved social advancement through military achievement. The distinctive military equipment and tactics attributed to Pelasgian fighters in classical sources suggest that their military traditions were valued by Greek commanders and incorporated into Greek military systems. The fortification techniques attributed to Pelasgian builders continued to be employed in Greek defensive architecture, indicating the practical value of their engineering knowledge. The mythological traditions preserved in later Greek literature provide extensive evidence for the role of Pelasgians in Greek foundation narratives and genealogical systems. Greek mythographers consistently portrayed Pelasgians as the original inhabitants of Greek lands, with many regional traditions describing how Greek heroes established their authority through marriages with Pelasgian princesses or conquest of Pelasgian kingdoms. These mythological accounts, while obviously not historically accurate in their specific details, preserve cultural memories of the relationship between Greek and pre-Greek populations. The genealogical systems developed by Greek mythographers typically incorporated Pelasgian figures as ancestors of Greek royal houses, providing legitimacy for Greek rule over formerly Pelasgian territories while acknowledging the indigenous status of pre-Greek populations. The figure of Pelasgus himself appears in numerous regional genealogies as an autochthonous king who ruled before the arrival of Greek populations, with his descendants being gradually incorporated into Greek royal lines through marriage alliances and political arrangements. Regional variations in foundation myths reflect different patterns of Greek-Pelasgian interaction across the Greek world. Athenian traditions emphasized the peaceful nature of early interactions, with myths describing how Pelasgian populations welcomed Greek settlers and contributed to the development of Athenian civilization. The Thessalian traditions present a more complex picture of conflict and accommodation, with myths describing both military conquest and intermarriage between Greek and Pelasgian populations. The preservation of Pelasgian elements in later Greek culture extended beyond mythology to include practical knowledge, technological innovations, and cultural practices that became integral components of classical Greek civilization. Agricultural techniques attributed to Pelasgian origins continue to be employed throughout the Greek world. Architectural methods associated with Pelasgian builders influenced the development of Greek monumental architecture. The massive stone construction techniques known as Cyclopean masonry, which ancient sources attributed to pre-Greek builders, continued to be used in Greek fortification systems throughout the classical period. Religious practices that derived from Pelasgian traditions became deeply embedded in Greek spiritual life, with many of the most important Greek religious centres showing clear evidence for pre-Greek origins. The oracular traditions at Dodona, the mystery cults at Eleusis and Samothrace, and numerous local cults throughout the Greek world preserved elements that ancient sources traced to Pelasgian religious innovations. These religious traditions provided continuity between the pre-Greek and Greek periods, while adapting to changing theological concepts and ritual requirements. The linguistic influence of Pelasgian languages on Greek dialects extended beyond simple vocabulary borrowing to include phonetic changes and grammatical constructions that affected the development of regional Greek dialects. The distinctive characteristics of certain Greek dialect groups, particularly those spoken in regions with substantial pre-Greek populations, likely reflect substrate influence from Pelasgian and other pre-Indo-European languages. These linguistic influences became permanent features of Greek dialectal variation and contributed to the diversity of Greek linguistic traditions throughout the classical period. Craft traditions attributed to Pelasgian origins continued to influence Greek material culture production throughout the historical period. The metalworking techniques associated with Pelasgian artisans appear in Greek bronze production, while pottery traditions showing pre-Greek characteristics persisted in certain regional contexts. The distinctive architectural features attributed to Pelasgian builders became standard elements of Greek monumental construction, particularly in fortification systems where their engineering innovations provided practical advantages that transcended cultural boundaries. The gradual nature of cultural assimilation between Pelasgians and Greeks created hybrid communities that combined elements from both traditions while developing new cultural forms that reflected their mixed heritage. This process of cultural synthesis contributed to the diversity and richness of classical Greek civilization, with many of its most distinctive characteristics deriving from the creative combination of Greek innovations with pre-existing Mediterranean traditions. The complexity of this cultural interaction challenges simple models of conquest and replacement, revealing instead a nuanced process of accommodation and synthesis that shaped the fundamental character of Greek civilization. The transformation from distinct Pelasgian identity to absorption within Greek civilization occurred through a complex series of demographic, political, and cultural processes that unfolded across several centuries during the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age periods. This gradual dissolution of Pelasgian distinctiveness resulted not from any single catastrophic event, but rather from sustained pressure applied through multiple mechanisms that systematically eroded the foundations of pre-Greek cultural autonomy, while incorporating valuable elements of Pelasgian civilization into emerging Greek political and social structures. The demographic pressures that contributed to Pelasgian decline began with the steady increase in Greek-speaking populations throughout the Aegean region during the 2nd millennium BC. Archaeological evidence from numerous sites demonstrates consistent patterns of settlement expansion that placed increasing stress on traditional Pelasgian territories. The fertile valleys of Thessaly, which had supported substantial Pelasgian communities for centuries, experienced intensive Greek colonization that gradually displaced indigenous populations from the most productive agricultural areas. Excavations at sites like Iolkos reveal stratigraphic sequences showing Greek settlement layers directly overlying earlier Pelasgian occupation phases, with minimal evidence for transitional periods that might indicate peaceful coexistence. The process of territorial displacement accelerated during periods of climatic stress, when competition for agricultural resources became particularly intense. Pollen analysis from lake sediments in central Greece indicates several episodes of reduced precipitation during the Late Bronze Age that would have decreased agricultural productivity and intensified competition between different population groups. Under these conditions, Greek communities with superior military organization and larger population bases possessed decisive advantages in securing access to scarce agricultural resources, forcing Pelasgian populations to accept subordinate status or seek alternative territories. Military conquest played a decisive role in eliminating Pelasgian political autonomy, though the specific mechanisms varied considerably across different regions and time periods. The Athenian conquest of Lemnos under Miltiades in the early 6th century BC represents the most thoroughly documented example of military action that directly terminated Pelasgian independence. Herodotus provides detailed accounts of the campaign, describing how Athenian forces systematically reduced Pelasgian strongholds through siege warfare that exploited superior Greek military technology and tactical organization. The siege techniques employed by Greek forces against Pelasgian fortifications demonstrate the technological advantages that Greek military engineers had developed through centuries of warfare experience. Archaeological evidence from Lemnos reveals destruction layers that show systematic dismantling of defensive works, with massive stone blocks being deliberately displaced to create breaches in previously impregnable walls. The precision of this destruction suggests coordinated engineering efforts that employed specialized siege equipment, including battering rams, scaling ladders, and possibly early forms of torsion artillery that could deliver concentrated force against specific structural weak points. The aftermath of military conquest typically involved population displacement that permanently severed connections between Pelasgian communities and their traditional territories. The Lemnian Pelasgians, according to classical sources, were expelled from the island following their defeat and forced to seek refuge in other regions where they lacked the territorial base necessary to maintain their distinctive cultural practices. This pattern of forced migration appears to have been employed systematically by expanding Greek city-states as a means of securing territorial control while eliminating potential sources of future resistance. Economic integration provided another mechanism through which Pelasgian distinctiveness was gradually eroded, as traditional craft specializations and trade relationships were incorporated into broader Greek commercial networks that operated according to different organizational principles. The distinctive metalworking traditions that had characterized Pelasgian material culture became absorbed into Greek production systems that emphasized standardized forms and decorative programs designed to appeal to Greek aesthetic preferences. Archaeological evidence from workshop contexts shows gradual transitions in production techniques that maintained technical excellence while adapting to new stylistic requirements imposed by Greek market demands. The transformation of pottery production illustrates this process of economic assimilation particularly clearly. Ceramic assemblages from sites with mixed Greek and Pelasgian populations show gradual evolution from traditional Pelasgian forms toward hybrid styles that combined pre-Greek technical innovations with Greek decorative preferences. The distinctive burnished surfaces and incised geometric patterns that had characterized Pelasgian ceramics were gradually replaced by painted decorations and vessel forms that conformed to Greek functional and aesthetic requirements, though certain technical innovations continued to distinguish regional production centres. Agricultural reorganisation accompanying Greek territorial expansion fundamentally altered the economic foundations that had supported Pelasgian communities for millennia. The intensive cultivation systems that Greeks developed for grain production required different land use patterns than the mixed agricultural and pastoral economies that had characterised Pelasgian settlements. Archaeological evidence from rural sites shows systematic changes in field boundaries, storage facilities, and settlement patterns that reflect the imposition of new agricultural systems designed to maximise grain production for urban markets rather than supporting diversified local subsistence economies. The introduction of Greek legal and administrative systems gradually undermined traditional Pelasgian social organisation by imposing new frameworks for property ownership, inheritance rights, and political participation that operated according to Greek cultural assumptions. The clan-based social structures that appear to have characterised Pelasgian communities were replaced by citizenship systems that emphasised individual rather than kinship-based rights and obligations. This transformation required fundamental changes in social identity that gradually eroded the cultural foundations upon which Pelasgian distinctiveness had been based. Religious syncretism provided perhaps the most complex mechanism through which Pelasgian cultural elements were simultaneously preserved and transformed within Greek civilization. The process of religious assimilation typically began with the identification of Pelasgian deities with Greek divine figures that possess similar attributes or functions, enabling the continuation of traditional cult practices within new theological frameworks. The transformation of the Dodona oracle exemplifies this process, with the pre-Greek earth deity being gradually identified with Zeus while maintaining distinctive oracular practices that preserved essential elements of Pelasgian religious tradition. The incorporation of Pelasgian religious sites into Greek sacred geography required careful negotiation between competing claims to divine authority and territorial control. Greek religious authorities typically resolved these tensions by acknowledging the antiquity and power of pre-Greek sacred sites, while asserting Greek divine ownership through mythological narratives that described how Greek gods had established their authority over formerly Pelasgian territories. The sanctuary at Delphi provides a classic example of this process, with Greek religious traditions acknowledging the site's pre-Greek origins while asserting Apollo's conquest of the earlier earth deity Python. Mystery cults provided particularly effective vehicles for preserving Pelasgian religious traditions within Greek religious systems because their secretive nature protected distinctive ritual practices from external scrutiny and modification. The Samothracian mysteries maintained Pelasgian characteristics throughout the classical period, partly because their esoteric nature prevented the kind of public religious standardization that affected more conventional Greek cults. The international appeal of these mysteries may have derived partly from their preservation of ancient religious wisdom that predated conventional Greek theological systems. The linguistic assimilation of Pelasgian populations involved complex processes of language shift that occurred at different rates in different social contexts. Formal political and commercial interactions required the use of Greek, creating strong incentives for Pelasgian populations to acquire Greek linguistic competence, while potentially maintaining their traditional languages for domestic and religious purposes. Archaeological evidence suggests that this bilingual phase could persist for several generations before complete language shift occurred, with the timing dependent on the intensity of contact with Greek-speaking populations and the degree of social integration achieved. Intermarriage between Greek and Pelasgian populations accelerated linguistic assimilation by creating households where Greek became the dominant language of communication. Children from mixed marriages typically acquired Greek as their primary language, while potentially maintaining passive knowledge of Pelasgian linguistic traditions through contact with extended family members. This generational language shift appears to have been irreversible once it began, with each successive generation showing reduced competence in traditional Pelasgian languages until they ceased to function as living communication systems. The preservation of Pelasgian linguistic elements in Greek dialects provides evidence for the substrate influence that resulted from language contact during the assimilation period. Phonetic features, vocabulary items, and syntactic constructions that resist Indo-European etymology appear throughout Greek dialectal variation, with particularly strong concentrations in regions where Pelasgian populations had been most numerous. These linguistic survivals became permanent features of regional Greek dialects and continued to influence Greek linguistic development throughout the classical period. Educational systems developed by Greek city-states played crucial roles in completing the assimilation process by ensuring that younger generations acquired Greek cultural knowledge while losing familiarity with traditional Pelasgian customs and values. The gymnasium system that emerged during the Archaic period provided comprehensive cultural education that emphasized Greek literary traditions, athletic practices, and civic values while systematically excluding non-Greek cultural elements. Participation in these educational institutions became essential for social advancement, creating powerful incentives for cultural assimilation among ambitious young people from Pelasgian backgrounds. The development of Greek historical writing during the classical period contributed to the erasure of Pelasgian cultural memory by creating standardized narratives about the Greek past that marginalized pre-Greek contributions to Mediterranean civilization. The historical accounts produced by writers like Herodotus and Thucydides, while acknowledging Pelasgian presence in earlier periods, presented Greek civilization as the natural and inevitable outcome of historical development, while treating Pelasgian culture as a primitive predecessor that had been rightfully superseded by superior Greek achievements. Legal mechanisms employed by Greek city-states systematically eliminated the institutional foundations that might have supported continued Pelasgian cultural distinctiveness. Property laws that favoured individual ownership over traditional kinship-based land tenure undermined the economic foundations of clan-based social organisation. Citizenship requirements that emphasised Greek ancestry and cultural competence excluded individuals who maintained strong identification with Pelasgian traditions. Religious regulations that standardised cult practices according to Greek theological principles eliminated the institutional support that traditional Pelasgian religious practices required for continuation. The urbanisation that accompanied Greek political development created new social environments that were inherently hostile to the maintenance of traditional Pelasgian cultural practices. The concentrated populations and intensive social interaction that characterized Greek city-states required standardized communication systems, legal frameworks, and cultural practices that could accommodate diverse populations within unified political structures. Traditional Pelasgian customs that had evolved to serve small-scale, kinship-based communities could not function effectively within these new urban environments without fundamental modification that typically resulted in their gradual abandonment. Commercial networks developed by Greek merchants created economic incentives that favoured cultural assimilation by providing access to broader markets and opportunities that were only available to individuals who possessed Greek cultural competence. Pelasgian craftsmen who adapted their production techniques to serve Greek markets could achieve economic success that was denied to those who maintained traditional practices. This economic pressure created powerful incentives for cultural change. that operated independently of direct political coercion, while achieving similar assimilative effects. The military service that Greek city-states required from their populations provided another mechanism for cultural assimilation by exposing individuals from Pelasgian backgrounds to intensive Greek cultural indoctrination. Military training emphasized Greek values of discipline, honor, and civic duty, while requiring participation in religious ceremonies and cultural practices that reinforced Greek identity. Veterans returning from military service brought these cultural influences back to their home communities, accelerating the process of cultural transformation even in areas that maintained some degree of cultural autonomy. Technological innovations introduced by Greek populations gradually displaced traditional Pelasgian technical knowledge by offering superior performance characteristics that provided decisive advantages in economic competition. The ironworking techniques that Greeks developed during the early Iron Age produced tools and weapons that were superior to traditional bronze implements, forcing Pelasgian craftsmen to adopt new technologies or accept economic marginalization. This technological pressure operated systematically across all areas of material culture production, gradually eliminating the technical distinctiveness that had characterized Pelasgian craft traditions. The administrative systems developed by Greek city-states required standardized record-keeping, legal procedures, and communication protocols that operated according to Greek cultural assumptions and linguistic requirements. Palastian populations who wished to participate in these administrative systems had to acquire Greek cultural competence and adapt their traditional practices to conform to Greek institutional requirements. This administrative pressure created systematic incentives for cultural assimilation that affected all aspects of social organisation from property ownership to religious observance. By the end of the Archaic period, the combination of demographic pressure, military conquest, economic integration, religious syncretism and cultural assimilation had effectively eliminated distinct Pelasgian identity throughout most of the Greek world. The last historical references to identifiably Pelasgian populations date to the 6th century BC, when Athenian forces completed the conquest of Lemnos and expelled the remaining Palastian inhabitants from their final autonomous territory. Archaeological evidence suggests that this military action marked the end of independent Palastian political organisation, though cultural elements derived from Palastian traditions continued to influence Greek civilization throughout the classical period and beyond. The archaeological record spanning the Bronze Age and early Iron Age periods provides the most substantial foundation for evaluating ancient claims about Palastian populations and their relationship to the broader demographic landscape of the Aegean world. This evidence, accumulated through more than a century of systematic excavation and analysis, reveals complex patterns of settlement, cultural development, and population movement that both support and complicate the testimonies preserved in classical literature. The material remains from this crucial period demonstrate that the Aegean basin supported diverse populations with sophisticated technological capabilities and extensive interregional connections long before the emergence of historically documented Greek civilization. The reliability of ancient sources regarding Palastian history requires careful assessment against archaeological evidence and modern understanding of how historical memory functions in pre-literate societies. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, drew upon oral traditions that had been transmitted across several centuries since the events he described. His account of Palastian origins and distribution reflects genuine historical memories preserved in local traditions, but these memories had been filtered through generations of retelling that inevitably introduced distortions and anachronistic elements. The geographic precision of his descriptions, particularly regarding Lemnos and the Troad, suggests access to reliable local knowledge, while his more general statements about Pelasgian characteristics and customs may reflect contemporary Greek assumptions about pre-Greek populations rather than authentic historical information. Thucydides approached Pelasgian history with greater analytical rigour, focusing on their role in early Athenian territorial development rather than attempting comprehensive ethnographic description. His account of Pelasgian expulsion from Attica reflects documented political events of the 6th century BC, while providing insights into earlier population distributions. However, his emphasis on political and military aspects of Greek-Pelasgian interaction may have oversimplified more complex processes of cultural accommodation and gradual assimilation that archaeological evidence suggests characterized most regions. Later sources like Pausanias and Strabo possessed extensive knowledge of physical remains and local traditions that earlier historians could not access, but they wrote within Roman imperial contexts that influenced their interpretation of pre-classical Mediterranean history. Their descriptions of Pelasgian architectural achievements and religious foundations preserve valuable information about material culture survivals, though their attempts to integrate this evidence within broader historical narratives reflect Roman period intellectual frameworks rather than ancient Mediterranean perspectives. The concept of Pelasgian, as employed by classical authors, functioned more as an explanatory category than as a precise ethnic designation, serving to account for pre-Greek cultural elements that persisted within classical civilization. Ancient writers used this term to explain the origins of massive stone fortifications, distinctive religious practices, and linguistic elements that clearly predated Greek settlement but remained integrated within contemporary cultural systems. This conceptual framework enabled classical authors to acknowledge the contributions of pre-Greek populations while maintaining narratives of Greek cultural superiority and historical inevitability. Archaeological investigation has revealed that Bronze Age Aegean populations possess sophisticated urban planning capabilities, advanced metallurgical knowledge, and extensive trade networks that connected communities across vast geographic distances. The settlement at Polyochni on Lemnos demonstrates urban organisation principles that rival contemporary developments in Mesopotamia and Anatolia, with defensive systems, residential districts, and craft production areas arranged according to coherent planning concepts. The technical quality of construction at this site indicates engineering knowledge and organisational capabilities that contradict earlier scholarly assumptions about pre-Greek technological limitations. Pottery production throughout the pre-Greek Aegean achieved levels of technical sophistication and artistic achievement that demonstrate mature craft traditions with deep historical roots. The ceramic assemblages from sites like Thermae on Lesbos and Emporio on Chios display consistent stylistic characteristics while showing regional variations that suggest both cultural unity and local innovation within broader shared traditions. The manufacturing techniques employed in producing these ceramics required specialised knowledge of clay preparation, kiln operation, and surface treatment that could only be acquired through generations of accumulated technical expertise. Metalworking evidence from Bronze Age Aegean sites reveals sophisticated understanding of alloy composition, casting techniques, and finishing procedures that enabled the production of complex bronze objects with both functional and ceremonial applications. The bronze industry at Polyochni employed advanced techniques, including lost wax casting and piece mould construction, that produced objects displaying remarkable technical quality and artistic sophistication. Chemical analysis of bronze artifacts from various Aegean sites shows systematic variation in alloy composition according to intended function, indicating detailed metallurgical knowledge that optimize material properties for specific applications. The fortification systems documented at pre-Greek Aegean sites demonstrate military architectural knowledge that influenced subsequent Mediterranean defensive construction throughout antiquity. The walls at Lerna in the Argolid employ construction techniques that parallel methods found at sites throughout the Aegean, suggesting shared engineering traditions that transcended local political boundaries. These defensive works required coordinated labour from substantial populations and demonstrate organisational capabilities that supported complex military and civil engineering projects. Religious architecture from Bronze Age Aegean contexts reveals distinctive approaches to sacred space organisation that differed markedly from later Greek temple design, while showing connections to contemporary Anatolian and Near Eastern traditions. The sanctuary complexes at sites like Philokopi on Melos feature architectural arrangements that emphasised communal participation in religious activities rather than the priest-mediated rituals characteristic of classical Greek religion. These design principles suggest theological concepts that view divine-human interaction as direct and accessible rather than requiring specialised religious intermediaries. The linguistic evidence preserved in place names throughout the Aegean region provides substantial support for the existence of pre-Indo-European populations whose languages contributed substrate elements to later Greek dialects. The distribution of toponyms featuring characteristic pre-Greek suffixes corresponds closely with areas where archaeological evidence documents Bronze Age settlement, supporting connections between linguistic and material culture evidence. River names throughout the region show particularly clear evidence of pre-Greek linguistic heritage, as hydronyms typically resist change during population transitions and preserve the most archaic linguistic elements in any given area. The Lemnian inscriptions discovered in the late 19th century provide direct evidence for non-Indo-European languages spoken in the Aegean region during the early Iron Age period. Comparative analysis of these texts reveals lexical and grammatical connections to Etruscan that suggest genetic relationships between languages spoken across substantial geographic distances. The existence of related languages in both the Aegean and central Italy supports theories of either large-scale population movements or the former existence of a linguistic continuum that extended across much of the central Mediterranean. Burial practices documented throughout the pre-Greek Aegean reveal consistent cultural patterns that distinguish these populations from contemporary Indo-European groups, while showing connections to broader Mediterranean traditions. The cemetery evidence from sites like Chalandriani on Syrus demonstrates sophisticated understanding of social organisation and religious concepts related to death and afterlife beliefs. The grave goods associated with these burials include locally produced objects alongside imports that demonstrate participation in extensive trade networks connecting Aegean communities with populations throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The economic foundations revealed through archaeological investigation demonstrate that Bronze Age Aegean populations supported substantial urban centres through intensive agricultural production, specialised craft manufacture, and extensive commercial exchange. The storage facilities documented at major settlements indicate systematic approaches to resource management that enabled communities to maintain substantial reserves through seasonal variations and periodic crop failures. These economic systems required administrative capabilities and social organisation that supported complex redistributive mechanisms and long-distance trade relationships. Settlement patterns throughout the Bronze Age Aegean reveal strategic considerations that balance defensive requirements with agricultural productivity and commercial opportunities. The distribution of major sites indicates hierarchical organisation with larger centres controlling surrounding territories and smaller communities, suggesting political systems that coordinated regional resources and defence capabilities. The consistency of these patterns across different islands and coastal regions indicates shared organisational principles that may reflect common cultural origins or extensive interregional communication. The transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age in the Aegean region involved complex processes of technological innovation, population movement, and cultural change that affected all aspects of material culture and social organisation. Archaeological evidence suggests that this transition occurred gradually over several centuries rather than through sudden demographic replacement, with new technologies and cultural practices being adopted selectively according to local conditions and requirements. The persistence of certain cultural elements through this transition period indicates remarkable continuity in some aspects of Aegean civilization, despite substantial changes in other areas. The relationship between archaeological evidence and ancient literary sources requires careful evaluation of both the strengths and limitations of each type of evidence. Material culture remains provide objective data about technological capabilities, settlement patterns, and economic systems, but they cannot directly reveal ethnic identities, linguistic affiliations, or specific historical events. Literary sources preserve cultural memories and historical traditions that supplement archaeological evidence, but they reflect the perspectives and biases of their authors rather than providing objective historical documentation. The integration of archaeological and textual evidence suggests that the population's ancient sources identified as Pelasgians represented the indigenous inhabitants of the Aegean region who possessed sophisticated cultural traditions and technological capabilities that significantly influenced the development of later Mediterranean civilizations. These populations maintained extensive trade networks, developed advanced urban planning concepts, and created religious and artistic traditions that continued to influence regional cultural development throughout antiquity. The significance of the Pelasgian question extends beyond narrow concerns with ethnic identification to encompass broader issues of cultural continuity, technological transmission, and population interaction in the ancient Mediterranean world. The evidence for pre-Greek populations in the Aegean demonstrates that the emergence of classical Greek civilization involved complex processes of cultural synthesis, rather than simple replacement of primitive populations by superior newcomers. The technological innovations, artistic traditions, and religious practices attributed to Pelasgian origins became integral components of classical Mediterranean civilization and continued to influence cultural development throughout antiquity. The study of Bronze Age and early Iron Age Aegean populations reveals the complexity of cultural interaction and demographic change in the ancient world, challenging simplistic models of ethnic replacement and cultural succession. The archaeological evidence demonstrates that sophisticated civilizations flourished in the Aegean region for millennia before the emergence of historically documented Greek culture, contributing fundamental elements to the classical civilization that would later dominate the Mediterranean world. Understanding these pre-Greek populations and their cultural achievements provides essential context for comprehending the true complexity and richness of ancient Mediterranean civilization and the diverse cultural traditions that contributed to its development. The legacy of Palastian civilization thus extends far beyond their direct historical presence to encompass their fundamental contributions to the technological, artistic, and spiritual foundations of Mediterranean culture. Their sophisticated understanding of metallurgy, architecture, and urban planning provided essential knowledge that enabled the construction of classical Greek cities and monuments. Their religious innovations, particularly in oracular practices and mystery cults, shaped the spiritual landscape of the ancient world and influenced religious development throughout the Mediterranean region. Their linguistic contributions, preserved in place names and dialectal variations, continue to affect the development of Greek language and literature throughout the classical period. The disappearance of distinct Pelasgian identity through processes of cultural assimilation and political integration represents one chapter in the broader story of cultural change and continuity that characterizes all human societies. While their independent political existence ended with the expansion of Greek city-states, their cultural contributions became permanently embedded within the civilization that succeeded them, ensuring their lasting influence on the development of European culture and thought. The study of Pelasgian civilization thus illuminates not only the specific history of pre-Greek Aegean populations, but also the broader patterns of cultural interaction and synthesis that have shaped human civilization throughout history.